Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everyone. If this is your first day of attendance, welcome. If it's your second day back, we want to welcome you back for day 2. We certainly appreciate your attendance and we're glad you're here. Just a few reminders. These sessions will be recorded and we will share them on the NEMSIS website for future reference. Please update your name and the participation list with your affiliation, especially if you're a software vendor, so we can ensure that you get the proper credit for the attendance at this meeting. This is a conversation.
She knew from Toby, she was in conversation with Toby, and
this is a conversation, and so we encourage you to ask questions, provide comments, give your input. Don't be shy. And we will capture all the feedback on the topics presented so that we can review your comments, your concerns, your questions at a later time. Microsoft Teams will be our backup platform. In the event there is a problem, we will notify you through the email that you registered with, and we'll send out the new connection information. And we know that you are all kind, respectful human beings on the planet. But just as a reminder, we're just asking for your respectful consideration of all the presenters and other participants. And with that, I am now going to turn the time over to Ms. Atem Effiam and Laurel Bader to talk about their topic on compliance, software compliance. So Laurel and Atem, it's up to you.
Thank you, Monet. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Laurel and I wanted to spend some time today going over the software vendor compliance process, and I'll do just a brief overview of the necessity for compliance. Review the policy. We'll discuss how vendors did within this new compliance policy process this first year. And then we hope to spend the rest of the time soliciting feedback and suggestions from you all about the vendor compliance process. So why is compliance necessary? It is a strict structured XML standard for ePCR data that must be maintained in order to ensure that the local EMS software and state and national repositories remain harmonized. And any software that's untested that participates in NEMSIS introduces variability that can quickly degrade the integrity of the data. So with compliance, we want everyone to be following the same standards so that all the data that comes in, wherever it comes in from, comes in the
same. George Ortega's calling, by the way.
And is harmonized. It also allows for states and agencies to submit their data to the national repository, and NEMSIS relies on strict data transmission to ensure success of the NEMSIS project. So a review of the compliance policy for software vendors that are maintaining compliance with NEMSIS, they are to complete compliance testing within 2 years of the last testing date that they did for either version 3.4 or version 3.5. They're also to attend at least 70% of the twice monthly V3 implementation calls each year, and they are to attend the V3 implementation annual meeting each year. So all of you that are here today, you are meeting that last one, which is really exciting. So let's talk about how vendors did in this first year with the new compliance policy. So we'll start with the loss of compliance and probation. So 16 software vendor products failed to complete the recertification by the end of 2020. But since this was our first year with this new requirement, we offered testing extensions to allow software vendors to meet the requirements. In total, only 10 products lost compliance, and for at least 2 of these products, this was a planned event. And then we have one product that's currently completed the waiting period and is reattempting testing. For recertifications and attendance, overwhelmingly, vendors are completing the recertification requirements, which is very exciting. Vendors are attending more than 80% of the V3 implementation calls that are held bi-monthly, and vendors are recertifying well before their due date. Additionally, we have had, or I shouldn't say vendors, there are 8 products that have completed 3.5 compliance testing with 4 products in progress. So this is very exciting. As you can see here, there are products that are on the receive and process side, and then as well as the collect. So we are very excited, and we'd like to thank everyone who has completed testing or initiated this testing. At this point, we would like to spend the remaining portion of our time getting some feedback and suggestions from you on the compliance process. Yesterday, some questions did already come up, so we know that people have been thinking about this, and we are ready to get some of that feedback from you. So I will turn the time over to Laurel, and we'll start going through asking you some questions.
Thanks, Atim. I'd just like to echo everything she said about recertifications and 3.5 testing, and congratulations to everyone who completed those requirements successfully and started that testing. We really appreciate those who come in well before the end of the year, their deadlines, and give themselves plenty of time to complete the process. So now on to the feedback part. I hope everyone's ready to come off of mute. So for compliance testing, we're just looking for any ideas or suggestions you have about this process that we could use to improve it, either to improve the integrity of our testing, or how difficult it is for vendors, or if states have suggestions as to things that they feel are gaps in testing. Now would be the time to bring those suggestions to the table. I've got a couple of just ideas here in the form of questions. If there are parts that you think are too onerous to complete, or parts that you think could be more thorough, just feel free to bring them up now. And we have already someone in the chat who wants to discuss custom elements. Peter, feel free to come off of mute and just go ahead and reiterate the question.
If I have to, I think it was Kristen from Image Trend yesterday that had a really good point about the custom elements. I don't know if she's on today and would like to reiterate her point. It was just very poignant, and I thought it made a lot of sense.
Hi, Peter. It's Kelly from Image Trend, but
Apologies.
there is a Kristen, and she's wonderful, so I'll happily take it. But yeah, I totally agree. I think that the compliance process is really well thought out. I think that NEMSIS does an amazing job, but I think that there are some improvements that could happen with those custom fields, just because we're never going to use those custom fields, but there are so many different options that maybe could enhance that. I think we should look into maybe streamlining that process, or at least identifying maybe some state compliance fields, or even just like there's going to be 5 fields and some of them are going to have pertinent negatives and not values, and just outlining what those are, and we can fill it in later. But I think that there's probably a better way to streamline that process if possible.
Thanks, Kelly and Peter. So I guess the question I would want to ask to follow up on that would be, how do states feel about NEMSIS's testing of custom elements? Because what the purpose of the testing is to ensure that data can be collected in an efficient, quick manner that meets the standard. So, I mean, I would just ask, do states feel like we have gaps around custom elements, or that the software products that they use and that they see agencies using are sufficient to capture that data and create those elements when needed?
Yeah, Laurel, this is Clay. If we don't if we don't hear comments from states yet, maybe we can get a little bit kind of deeper into this, if it's okay. May I ask a question? We've thought about this. This is a great comment, and Peter and others in the past have brought this up to us. So we've had some real meaningful conversations about how to make this happen. I'd love Kelly or Peter or someone else, if you could kind of define or walk us through what it might look like, right? So we've talked about this, like if we used existing state custom elements that we just pull from the custom element library, and that's what we ask folks to build to. But Zoll may be asked to build an element for a state for which they don't have any clients, right? So again, it's a bit of a waste of time for Zoll. So that doesn't sound like the perfect solution. If we just utilized existing custom elements that are present in states, well, that doesn't complete the testing and provide the type of validity testing that we'd like to accomplish. So it's a great idea. I think we're 100% behind reducing the needless burden, but it would be great to help kind of frame up a way where that could work and be valuable. Peter or Kelly or others, have you thought of an idea as to what that might look like?
Clay, one idea I had is to like predefine. So maybe still keep those custom fields, but say that there's going to be 10 fields. And you guys could select which 10 fields you assign people. But we know beforehand that we're going to need a pertinent negative field. We're going to need a demographic field that does pertinent negative in not values. And you can randomly assign those fields out and continue to use them so that you know for sure that whatever you want to test us on, we can fulfill that need. But we kind of can reuse them as necessary, which maybe that defeats the point, but at least would give us something so we're not continually building these fields that are really useless. And then your other point about vendors that don't have clients in certain states, at some point that vendor might actually get a client in that state. So it really isn't useless for, sorry to pick on Zoll, but for Zoll to build that, because at some point they might actually get a client in that state. So at that point, they actually would be able to use that state field.
Yeah, good point. Good point, Kelly. Josh, do you want to chime in? Let's play a little bit of devil's advocate. I really like the approach that Kelly is kind of describing. Can we kind of we have to ensure, right, that we're providing a valid test, right? Josh, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I guess so. To push back a little bit, could we come back to vendors and say, well, these custom elements, I mean, the design of the standard is that it shouldn't be too hard to create a custom element. I think I understand that there's all the nuances. You got to decide where it's going to go in your systems and everything. But, you know, that's, I think, maybe the counter argument. And I'd love to hear from state data managers. You know, would a state data manager say, yeah, we have had problems with vendors implementing our custom elements. They need to be able to do it faster. Or are the states confident that the vendors have done a good job implementing their custom elements, and are the states okay with, you know, I guess backing off a little bit in terms of how fresh these custom elements are in the testing?
This is Anne in Arizona. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
And Mark Roberts just put in a comment that I also kind of agree with. I think I don't even completely understand sometimes where the issues exist. So I don't feel super confident talking about this. I do know in our state, we've had some custom elements that we have required because of emergency mandate and then a statute that went into place. And we have some for voluntary programs that agencies will decide to join. And both of them, we've kind of had issues, and I don't think any of the vendors have been, you know, purposely difficult. I think it's more just, my understanding is it takes development time, which takes, you know, potentially, like Mark said, there's a charge. In our state, we probably don't have as many vendors as some states, but we still have, you know, 10, 12 vendors. And it becomes really confusing because I find out maybe later on that a state agency wasn't reporting something, not because they didn't have any, but because their vendor didn't build the element, which puts us really farther behind than just saying, hey, now add it to your run form. So I don't think the use of custom elements is going to go away, even for individual states. I don't think states are ever going to want to go to something where and I don't think this is what we're talking about, where if NEMSIS doesn't agree with the element, it doesn't get added, because like I said, it's ultimately up to like our governor but yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that anybody would disagree that if you can make the process easier, if it would take, you know, less time for development. I don't know, maybe that's how language the different systems are programmed in. I would be for that, because it isn't, it's like Eric talked about yesterday, not blaming anybody, but the system is not very agile to change. It's, you know, by the time we get something in there, like the travel questions, didn't really matter if someone had traveled from an Asian country by the time we were able to kind of collect travel history, for example. So I would definitely be in favor of there being more of an agile approach, but I also get that you can't have states requesting 700 different custom elements all at the same time and expecting vendors to build them all.
Thank you, Anne. That was actually something I was going to ask, was if the timeliness of the custom elements was an issue in practice for states. One of the approaches that I've always took in reading that document was that we asked for those custom elements to be completed within 90 days to test not just the ability to create them, but the ability to create them in a timely manner. We defined that as the 90-day testing period, but is that requirement too strict or unnecessary for real-world applications? And it sounds like in some cases it might be necessary to complete them quickly, but do others have thoughts about that?
This is Samantha with ESO, and the 90-day part is reasonable because custom elements do require development time for UI testing, for database, and then as well as the actual extract testing, and that takes our time. Plus, we have to insert it on a roadmap, and generally that means that we have to stop development on something else, or we have to prioritize and make decisions. And in the case of compliance testing, if we are making a custom element for a compliance test that we'll never use again, it might mean that we can't get to another state's compliant custom element that they're trying to do. So I am very much in favor of either using the national elements, using existing state elements, using a predetermined set of elements like Kelly suggested, that we can go back and recycle. And I guess my question back would be, for the compliance test, is what the vendors are trying to prove is that we can do it in a timely manner, or that we can just do it at all?
Yeah, and I have to agree with Samantha. This is Peter again. That's the kicker for us too, is if we're building these custom elements, that means that we're not building some other feature that could make documentation easier, or even building something to make building custom elements easier. We have to put on the side so that way we can build the custom elements for testing.
Typically, there's no problem with that. I think the major thing is we don't want it to be throwaway code. We don't want it to be an arbitrary state with an arbitrary set of custom elements. We wanted something that can be consumable by someone in the future.
So if we were to use, say, the national custom elements or a library of existing elements for testing, and they were available before the testing process was initiated, how would that ensure that the elements could be completed in a timely manner? Because if you had them from the beginning, you could do all 50 of them all at once a year in advance, and then you're set for your next, I don't know, 10 testing periods. Or am I not understanding the suggestion?
Well, and so I guess my question back is, the compliance document states just that we can implement a custom element. It doesn't say anything about it being timely. So if the compliance test is for it to be timely, then I think it's throwaway code. If it is just to prove that we can implement a custom element, then I think we can use one of our national or another solution, but something that isn't throwaway, something that would be used in the app. As Keenan said, it is painful to spend dev resources all the way through the cycle on something that will never actually be used.
Yeah, these are great comments. And I'm just going to throw out some crazy things, right? Let's see if we can meet the requirement here and reduce the workload. I think both issues, being able to implement and in a timely fashion, are important. You're right. I don't know that the timely is mentioned. We'll have to check that. Thank you. That's good to know. It is something that we do talk about with Eric and others at the Office of EMS. So there is, and particularly during 2020, that was a real issue, as Ann mentioned as well. So I think it's important. What if okay, and maybe this is a stupid idea. What if we took national elements and just asked for the testing, we added another code. We made some modification to it that made it still applicable, right? With a major modification, or with a slight modification back to the national standard, but we included some change that made it clear that it had to be evaluated and had to be implemented, quote, fresh, as you mentioned, Josh, that term. Does that have any validity, Laurel or Josh?
You're saying, like, if we took, for example, one of the existing national custom elements or an existing state custom element and we slightly tweaked it for testing?
Yeah, or modified it in some way that ensured that the bulk of the work that was done associated with the development of that custom element was reusable.
So I think we'd lose some of the robustness of the testing. Right now we test, I think, every different type of custom element we could possibly test, adding values to an element, a whole new element, elements that are in a grid format, demographic elements, EMS elements. There's 5 or 6, I believe, in our current set. So if we just had slightly modified elements, I think that it would maybe take away from that. But on the other hand, perhaps we need to evaluate whether running all of those tests on every recertification is necessary. Maybe we only test one type of custom element each year, or maybe we only test custom elements less often, every 5 years instead of 2 years, or maybe we can just reduce the frequency. I'm a little concerned that if we reduce the thoroughness of the test, that it'll make the whole process just less valuable overall.
Yeah, what do vendors think about that idea?
I like the idea that it's kind of meeting in the middle. So we still can go through with testing and make sure we fulfill those requirements. But I also want to point out, like, we're developing 3.5 and that is proof that we can adapt. And plus, we've gone through compliance so many times. We've proven as vendors time and time again that this can be done. So I do think that that's kind of meeting in the middle. So maybe not requiring it every single time, but still checking that box off every other year or every 5 years, whatever it might be.
Clay, I don't particularly think tweaking the current elements slightly would be of great value, especially if they can't be propagated down to our customers and useful for everyone. And I think that possibly not as often is good. I mean, you guys have to figure out this timeliness question if you'd like. There's also sort of this thing where nowhere in the country are we going more than 90 days without someone coming up with a new custom element as far as states go. So is it that we maybe start saying, let's just use the latest or the second most latest set of custom elements that were developed by a state?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Keenan. That's helpful.
I believe
No,
we've done that in the past with another vendor where we had an issue with a custom element is we just asked for proof of a different element to satisfy the requirement. And I did want to speak to something Kelly said about established vendors who sort of proven that they're adaptable. When we did first start doing recertification, we did see a number of vendors that did struggle with custom element implementation. So as much as I hate to say it, you know, we see everyone moving to 3.5, but I've also seen places where, you know, maybe we're not as adaptable as we'd like to be.
well, as far as the timeliness goes, remembering the past year, I think the big hurdle was not necessarily getting the custom elements created. It was what elements do we create, and then how do we encode that data? So maybe if we can define those types of things ahead of time, so we kind of know in the next emergency locations will be coded this way, and we can be kind of prepared and react more quickly in that way.
Yeah, Scott, you're right. We didn't respond, I think, at a national level as quickly as we could have to try to standardize those approach to a number of those custom kind of history questions. So yeah, thank you. That was very true. So I think the idea that you brought out, Laurel, we can kind of keep on the table, and just to remind folks, right, we have kind of limited time here to make sure that we kind of get some ideas on the table, and we'll flush them out during the year as we usually do associated with this meeting. So the collection of ideas and kind of your first blush as to whether that'll work or not work is incredibly helpful. Greg, from RAM Software, I see your idea listed. Can you flesh that out a little? Just in unmuting. Is that okay, Greg?
Yeah, I don't have any specifics in mind. I was just thinking, like, if you go through the process of doing the certification initially, you've proven, I think it was Kelly that mentioned, you've proven you can do it. Like, at this point, we're looking to recertify and go through, just show that we still can, but as far as the custom elements, like I'm with everybody else, we don't want to be developing stuff that we throw away.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I thought maybe part of your question was that maybe if the recertification for custom elements occurred at a different time, or it didn't have to be associated with the same 90-day period where you're preparing for the rest of the recertification, that might be helpful. But yeah, good.
So, Clay, this is significant. Are you suggesting combining those last two suggestions of recertification at a different time, and then anytime NEMSIS adds a national custom element, we could just say, hey, here's our proof that we did this in a timely manner, and send off that as a custom element recertification test?
Yeah, I don't know if that is another idea for us to put on the table. I mean, I'm happy to do that. That's kind of what I got out of Greg's comment. And yeah.
It's an interesting idea. I like that.
I do want to speak to the fact that Laurel said earlier, where there was a lot of vendors who had issues with custom elements before, and that recertification process not necessarily going perfectly in the beginning. But I think the changeover to the new recertification process has kind of fleshed out the vendors that were having difficulties and where those difficulties were, just by the process of being more thorough. And I know we're talking that we still need to do this recertification every year, but I think the new process really has improved to the point where maybe we don't need to be as thorough every time, every year.
Yeah, Peter, that's a good thought. Hey, that relates a little bit to kind of a string of comments that kind of earned initiated from John Burkhart. Can you kind of narrate that comment a little, John?
Sure. Yeah, I would say that for us, it hasn't never been a problem. We took the time up front to implement the custom configurations section the way NEMSIS defines it, where it's easy for states or vendors to add their own custom configs. And we don't require coding to do those. There's a UI for it, or we can pull it in right from what we get from the state. The state data set defines them and we can pull them right in. But we spent a lot of time coding it so that happens.
Yeah, thanks, John.
And we would love to do something similar to that. We had to push it to build custom elements this year for testing though.
Yeah.
Right, that's what I'm saying. It's all about how you've chosen to implement custom configurations. If you spend the time up front, then not so bad in the back. So that's just how we've chosen to define them.
So I think we have some good ideas. I certainly have several noted down regarding the timeliness issue of custom elements, less frequent testing, less elements in the test set, using a library. If anyone has any additional custom element ideas, let's add them in now, and then we can kind of move forward. I think we still have plenty of time left, but if there are any other areas that we need to touch on in compliance testing, I would like to leave at least a little bit of time for those. And of course, if anyone has any ideas that they felt that they didn't want to bring up in the chat or in this meeting here, you're always welcome to email us with your suggestions or concerns about the testing process. Any additional ideas for how to make custom elements better?
Hey, Laurel.
Yes.
It's Doug in Nebraska. I always kind of have in my back pocket, the thoughts for the patient. And yesterday's conversation was kind of hard to swallow a little bit, but I learned a lot about what was going on with data and NEMSIS being a data source. So, but even in writing these elements, they got to be towards somehow it's making it better for the EMS system out there in the world, not just something to create and try and, is the green light of the Fifth and Evans supposed to be green? There's some of them are silly, but somehow they got to me, has to combine both the patient need and the absolute need of the purpose of NEMSIS and pushing out data.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. That's a great reminder.
All right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide, Atin. Okay, so now I want to move on and touch on the issue of participation in these NEMSIS calls and meetings. Just ideas to get our discussion going. How do we make these calls more valuable to you? How do we make this meeting more valuable to you? And if anyone has had any trouble with participation, either just being here and getting your time, having your time be worthwhile, or any issues in tracking, please let us know now.
Yeah, this is Clay. I'll bring up one related question here that was brought to our attention in an email yesterday. So this is a good opportunity to talk about. You can go ahead and mute Laurel if you want. The idea was that there is mergers going on in the industry, and once a merger has occurred, do you still have to have representatives from both products participating in the calls and participating in the meeting? It was a great question, and we talked about maybe defining that process a little more, and that we hadn't really addressed it in these requirements. So I think the idea is coming up with some kind of language that if a merger has occurred and then a company indicates that product will be sunsetted, I don't know, within 12 months or something, right? We'd come up with a process whereby multiple representatives that now kind of represent the same company wouldn't need to be on all the calls. So we kind of heard that loud and clear, and we're kind of thinking through that. So any other thoughts about that idea?
I think that, not to shoot myself in the foot here, sunsetting dates happen to change depending on market needs and company needs. But I think that when organizations have someone who's responsible for interacting with the states and interacting with the NEMSIS TAC and these calls, that person can be a centralized source for all of the dev teams and the managers and product people who oversee those teams. And thusly, we don't necessarily need one person or one person per product or one person per dev team to be defined as who attends.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, Mark Roberts raises a good point, and that kind of speaks to Keenan too, right? That you can have this moving target for sunsetting, and we talked about that last night as well too. So we'll try to kind of work through that as well. Yeah, Steve makes the point that the annual meeting could continue to be virtual, but we would miss out on the bacon. That's for sure.
Clay, ultimately, we don't want to have to send 4 people to every meeting every month for 4 different products if we have one person whose job it is to look at all of them.
Yeah. Thanks, Keenan. We'll rethink that. So that was a good cue for us to kind of maybe refine that process a little bit with Eric. We were talking to Eric. Eric's actually here in Salt Lake City with us, so Eric was part of that conversation last night. So we'll get that figured out. Yeah. What about this idea of the annual meeting? It clearly saves a lot of money, as was mentioned, right? To do this virtually. I think there's great value. You know, I don't know, maybe I'm old fashioned, but I still think there's great value when I meet a person face to face and can talk with them not only during the meeting but during the off times. We could do, a virtual 1 year, and the odd years are virtual, the even years are in Deer Valley, or I try to make it a hybrid where that's continues, I think, to be hard. We don't see the technology working very well to have like open mic discussions work well for folks who are online. Maybe others have figured that out and it can work out better now, but Would love other comments related to the annual meeting being virtual or back at Deer Valley or some hybrid of the two.
Clay, this is Eric. I think given that this is under a federal contract, what you're going to see is we're going to have to follow the federal guidelines that are coming out. And I know for FICOMs and for NEMSAC, and we'll use them as an example, typically at a federal interagency committee for EMS or FICOMs meeting, you would have the roughly 12 individuals that are making up the committee and maybe 40 to 60 people in the audience in attendance. We went to virtual meetings for that and supplemented them. In the first round of COVID, we had one in-person meeting with virtual attendance, and we went up to 400 participants. So the NEMSAC meetings also went from maybe 20 people in the room plus the 24 members up to over 300. So I think what the direction is going to be from our federal leadership is that we have to have these meetings offered. We can offer the meeting in person, but we have to have a virtual presence as well. And you're right, it does make it difficult to have these kind of back-to-back discussions. And but I think there's some technology ways that we can fix that. It does require us to make agendas a little bit more rigid because if someone wants to call in for a specific topic and that topic's supposed to happen on day 2 at 12 o'clock, then we need to make sure it happens, maybe half hour earlier, half hour later, and let everyone know they should dial in a little bit early for something. But there are some tricks to it. I think there'll be a learning curve, but going forward, if we do an in-person meeting, we're going to almost have to have a virtual presence as well.
Thanks, Eric.
But I do prefer in-person meetings too. I'm old school as well.
Thank you. Are there any other thoughts? I've seen some in the chat as well. Any other thoughts or anything people want to share about participation, either the bi-monthly calls or the annual meeting?
This is Josh. I'm just curious if any participants have feedback and thoughts regarding just the content, the interactions, the usefulness of those V3 implementation calls. Like, do you all feel like they're really hitting the topics that are important to you as a vendor or a state data manager? Are they engendering discussion, the right amount of discussion? Are they leading to good decisions? Any feedback on that?
Yeah, affirmation by fiat. We hope there's comments. If folks think it's working, let us know it's working. We have, you may have noticed, we get more and more requests for folks to join and share thoughts regarding parallel projects. So NEMSCO is a good example, or the work that the state and territorial epidemiologists are doing to identify opioids. So those, we've allowed those folks to come into that call. Has that been helpful, just to help folks stay aware of what's happening in the environment related to data collection?
Clay, I'll ask the question about, I've been talking a lot about the Federal Health IT Coordinating Council, and we just got their, I'll give you an example. This morning, I just got their quarterly report. Is making that available to the vendors. I'm happy to do that. It's not, I mean, it's open source. It's not something specific to the feds, although their meetings are limited to the federal government employees, and I can't even get Clay invited. So, is making that kind of information available to you something that you're interested in? Here's what they're working on, especially the work from ONC that talks about national standards for data and what they're going to require the hospitals to do. I think a lot of it would be of interest to you, and I'm happy to make it available either through our Google groups or posting it. So more specific on NEMSIS.org, so you can find it. We'll put it wherever you think it's best for you to access it, but I just want to make sure there's an interest.
Eric, I think there is an interest. I think we appreciate all of the inclusion that we can get as a stakeholder group. And same thing with you, Clay. I think that having other parties present, even if it's sort of just adjacent to NEMSIS, but it's still in the data collection space, since you have all the right people in the right rooms, it's of great benefit. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Keenan. I mean, I get a ton of stuff almost on a daily basis. And there's so many federal health IT projects. A lot of them, are circled around defense and security and things like that. But a lot of it, the focus, especially in this administration, is healthcare oriented and equities in healthcare. And, I try to make sure that it goes out to the individuals, especially if it's state specific, that it's pertaining to. So, if I start to overburden you with things, please let me know. But I'd rather you have too much and just kind of delete it than not know about something I think might be important.
Yeah, this is Clay again. I don't want Jeff's comment to get too far down in the chat. He makes a good comment about the appropriateness of elements. Yeah, this continues to be an issue for us. Eric actually put together the internal advisory board group, the SME group, to take a good look at whether there needs to be a reduction in elements, and I know that's on their agenda. I did want. I have a question that's more related to the compliance testing process. I just wanted to throw out. Sorry, Laurel, but we can finish if there's other comments about the participation on calls or the meeting.
These were all the questions we had on participation. I think we have a couple other after this, a couple other questions on a different topic after this, but go ahead, Clay.
Okay, I apologize. If there's other comments, please post them in the chat. As we mentioned, we copy the chat and we review every single comment. We read it out loud and discuss it together. So we will get to it. I did want to throw out the idea about the testing schedule. So and I haven't discussed this with anybody on our team yet. So if this is just off the wall, then just mute me. But I think there has been some trouble or some kind of additional burden associated with the fact that the deadline for compliance testing is associated with the calendar year, right? And we end up right at the peak of holiday season as the window closes for testing. And of course, folks can come in earlier, right? We all have the best intentions to come in very early with lots of things in our lives, but I think we end up for a variety of reasons getting held up. Would it be helpful to take the scheduling for compliance and not associated with the calendar year? Would that somehow be helpful? Like if the deadline occurred in the middle of the fall or in the spring, would there be value there? Are people struggling with the fact that we bump up against the Christmas and New Year holiday?
Clay, this is Samantha with you. So quick question. I thought the compliance was like from your last date of compliance, not necessarily calendar year.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Yeah, that's true. That okay. Was, yeah. Thank you for that correction. You're right.
Yeah, and so I mean, I'm thinking about us, and ideally we'll be, coming for compliance, in October for 3.5, which is later than I wanted, but COVID keeps getting in the way. And so then we would just be on that October cycle, and hopefully we can push it into the summer where it's, ideally you're a little bit not as slammed with compliance testing, but I think as long as we're keeping it within a time period of our last date, then we're in good shape.
Thank you. Yep. You're correct. I was thinking about the catch up that we did with the new session or the new process. Yeah, thank you, Samantha.
So I can offer some clarity on those timelines. So for the compliance testing, we're requiring within 2 years of your last certification date, which does for a good number of vendors fall in the fourth quarter. And with the participation, we're doing a once a year removal at the end of the calendar year. So that one is the one that's tied to calendar year.
Yeah, that's right.
So if you stop attending in January, we would not remove you for participation until December when we clean out the list for that reason.
So I know that Mark is on this call, and a lot of us ended up in that end of calendar year because we were attempting to get certified for the first time. California put out their regulation around getting a yearly certification. So I guess the question would go to Mark, since it's mostly up to him at this point. Would he be comfortable with some sort of extension to his current timeline that would allow the vendors to spread out the testing so it's not all on, January 1st on Laurel and a team to make sure that everybody is getting pushed through? I don't know if you want to speak to that, Mark. I mean, we're planning to start testing early. It's just that's where everybody ended up.
I'd just like to say that I appreciate concern for our team, but we do have some extra support around the holiday season when there's an increase in testing, and we're planning to have extra support in the fourth quarter of this year when we will see more people for 3.5 testing. So thank you, but we have accounted for that in our plans.
Fair enough.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, thanks for walking through that discussion. That was helpful. So Laurel, do you have a new question here with the slide?
Yeah, so this is just our catch-all question. If there was, any other services that vendors or states would like us to offer to assist folks in obtaining and maintaining their compliance certification, or if there's any sort of areas of the larger process that anyone thinks are ripe for improvement, whether it's the documentation, which right now is 4 sort of lengthy documents. Would it help if we prepared a sort of shorter one-pager that hits all the highlights, whether it's test cases? Right now, we currently offer a testing package of 6 cases, 1 DEM, 5 EMS, and a state data set. Is that too little, too many? For those of you that have done a web conference call with us recently, are there aspects of that call that have been difficult or didn't work for whatever reason? The pre-testing package, we still offer this and it's completely optional. Is there any way that we could make it more beneficial to folks that are seeking compliance, or should we eliminate it? Is it not useful at all? The 90-day testing period, is that too wide? Is it too narrow? We already covered custom elements in depth. Defined list testing, only a few vendors have gone through defined list testing, but if anyone has any suggestions on how we can effectively look at defined lists and determine that they've been implemented properly, or has any suggestions about that area of your software implementation in general, we'd love to hear those. Schematron testing, if there's any feedback there. And then I know almost everyone who's tested recently has used our CTA web service and web application. And if there's any spaces you'd like to see improvement in that area, we'd also love to hear those as well. So no, that's kind of a long list, but this is our catch-all. If there's anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to see changed, please let us know now.
So I feel like I'm the only one talking right now, but I love the CTA process. The instant feedback is amazing. It allows us to catch problems before we bring it up to you guys. The only thing that I had issues with is there's certain areas where the software might output like a nil value differently that gets flagged as wrong. That's not necessarily wrong. That can cause confusion, especially if I'm handing that testing to some of my QA folks. Is there any way that, I don't know if it's doing like a direct XML comparison or if there's any way to kind of say, hey, when it gets to the dates, don't flag those or something like that?
Yeah, so it does use another piece of software to just directly compare the two documents. We have added comments for things that, for example, should be different, like UUIDs, that your test cases should not match ours for UUIDs. And we've added notes for some things that could be different. Like I believe there's a number that comes from a CAD system that obviously many systems can't just type in whatever they want there. It comes from a different system. So we could potentially add notes to those documents to say that, the dates can differ as long as accounting for time zones, it's the same time or something to that effect. Or we would accept two types of not values here. Although there are a lot of cases where we do want to see that you have the ability to say not applicable as well as not recorded. One of the things I see frequently is vendors who submit not recorded in place of not applicable. And those are not the same thing. And there are reasons why you would really want one element to say not applicable rather than not recorded. Like, for example, e-arrest elements in a case of arrest is no arrest, no cardiac arrest. You want the arrest elements to be not applicable, not recorded, because they did not apply to the situation, for example.
And Peter, this is Josh. Your submissions undergo some pre-processing before they get compared to the gold standard test case. Things like sorting, so that if you provided the crew members in a different order, that's fine. It gets sorted out and compared correctly. So yeah, if you see some areas where it highlights differences and you think that it's not significant, that it highlighted that difference, if you want to just indicate, which submission it was and which data element, then Laurel could take a look, I could take a look. We could make sure that it truly is an insignificant difference. And if it is, we could probably account for it in that pre-processing stage.
Awesome, appreciate that.
And this is Samantha with VSO. I want to put a vote in for keeping the pre-testing package, please. I do find that very useful.
Agreed from Image Trend as well. I think it's super helpful.
Thank you too. Usually I hear nothing about it, but it's helpful to know that the people are still finding that useful.
Well, I'll say that I think the process is very streamlined, and you could tell that you guys put a lot of thought and effort into making it work. And kind of mirroring what Peter said, I think the CTA web application is incredibly helpful. So like you guys really have put a lot of effort into it, which is very much appreciated.
Yeah, year 2 through the process, recompliance versus year 1 is thoroughly better, and that CTA web allocation is great.
We've also noticed that the PCRs themselves are more clinically accurate, and there's not just a scattering of data points. So thank you for that.
Thank you, guys. All credit to Josh on our great test cases. He's done an amazing job putting those together.
Yeah, and to Julianne for making sure that what I come up with actually is clinically accurate.
Hey, this is Jason from Digitech. So really good job on the 3.5 collect data testing, just hashing out and making sure that everything, all the changes that were done for 3.5 were there. The one thing that I noticed that wasn't in any of the test cases that you might want to consider is for e-situation 10, other associated symptoms. Symptoms not present, the pertinent negative added there. Something that we had to secondary address to make sure that we had it correct whenever for data collection.
Thank you. We'll make a note to include that on next year. So let's see, I'm trying to think of if there's anything else. The only other question I can think of is the similarity between the 3.4 and 3.5 test cases. I know that many of you are working in both versions. Has it been helpful that we kept the same custom elements and roughly the same test cases for both versions for testing this year?
This is Smith with you. So I think that's great that the custom elements would be the same. It definitely reduces our burden on the throwaway code. So I appreciate that. I think it's great.
All right, so we're getting near the end of our hour. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was also going to say that also helps us, if we're going to be doing compliance for both 3.4 and 3.5, to only have to enter that information once is super useful. So I appreciate that as well.
Awesome, thank you, Peter. And Peter, you're allowed to speak up as much as you want. If you feel like you're the only one making comments, well, then you're the only one whose comments are being heard. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of the hour. Does anyone have anything else with compliance that they'd like to bring up? A point about timing in the chat. Matthew in the chat is pointing out a gap in our compliance testing recertifications for 3.4. We'll take a look at that and address that gap.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's valuable to bring up. And Mark mentions the delay to 3, but we're going to be talking about the timeline this afternoon as well, both the closure of 3.4 and what's happening with 3.5. So we'll cover that. Yeah, thanks, Mark.
All right. If anyone has any additional questions about compliance, feel free to email us at any time. Atom or I would be happy to take your email, or you can email our NEMSIS email address, and that would get sent out to the appropriate parties. Whatever your question is, just again, thank you to everyone who has started compliance, completed compliance, or done anything else to help us further the integrity of the NEMSIS data standard. We really appreciate the partnership we have from everyone in the vendor community and who shows up to these calls and gives us feedback and helps us improve. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And we'll turn it over to Ben.
Thank you both. So we are actually coming up on a scheduled 10-minute break. We're about 5 minutes ahead of schedule. So we'll keep it to about 10 minutes and we'll come back at 10:20 Mountain Time. I'll put that in the chat as well. And then we'll hear from Eric for a little bit. Thanks.
Yeah, Mark's got a point. Mark's got a point, Ben. You got to open your own support
ticket. Yeah, I think so.
Hey, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor and privilege to talk to all of you. It really is. This next topic I want to talk about is taking us all the way back to January 2020. And that seems like 100 years ago to me. I'm not sure how it sits with all of you. In late 2019, the National Security Council in the White House, under the direction of Dr. Dave Wade, took an interest in developing, they call it a sub-PCC, which is basically a subcommittee that looks at specific tasks and projects. And this one was the integration of standardization of EMS data in the hospital and clinical records. So we were asked to participate because of NEMSIS. Full disclosure, I had worked for Dr. Wade in the past, and Dr. Kramer and Dr. Wade are also close colleagues, as well as Dr. Gettinger at ONC. So we had a lot of key people in this project who had worked together and knew one another in the past. We saw this as a great opportunity and then just fully participated as much as we could. The bottom line is we actually ended up through NHTSA's Office of EMS doing all the logistics works and running the meeting through the Federal Interagency Committee on EMS. The purpose was basically to improve EMS outcomes by monitoring and trying to support the integration and standardization of data between the pre-hospital and hospital environment. They had a really cool problem statement. It basically said for the inability to routinely collect, link, and exchange standardized healthcare data between EMS and hospitals, clinics, and physician offices limits the necessary bidirectional information exchange and hinders systematic analysis and treatment activities in the important locations of care delivery. So basically, they were building off work that was done in 2016 in June when ONC released a document called Health Information Exchange and Emergency Medical Services. And it basically outlined and provides very specific bullet points on the benefits of integrating EMS data into HIEs. And again, I'll make sure that all these documents get posted where you can access them and look at them. The meeting was run in 3 different segments. The first segment was an overview of hospital data collection. And the second was a pre-hospital data collection overview. And then the third was sort of a data exchange run by ONC. Now, the important part, I guess, in all of this, at least for me, was in putting some of the logistics together was, wow, we put 130 people in a room together, and it was all because of the National Security Council requirements, as I stated yesterday, it was required that everybody had to attend in person. But we put 130 people together that, to my knowledge, had never been in the same room. We had EPCR vendors, electronic health vendors for hospitals, for clinics. We had just about anybody that had anything to do. There were data exchange groups and non-governmental organizations that I never heard of. As we started inviting people, we would get telephone calls. Hey, why weren't we invited to this? The answer was, we didn't know you existed, but here's what we're trying to do. All were interested. So we brought in everybody we possibly could. The interesting part was the most difficult challenge I had was in getting the electronic healthcare vendors from the hospitals to participate. In a couple of cases, I actually used the National Security Council name dropping and said, hey, look, we're inviting you, and got a letterhead put together and made a formal request. So again, full disclosure, I want to make sure that everybody gets the background and understands why some of these things happen, because I think in prior people in my position, they just kind of tell you things and you don't really get the full picture. So that's how it got started. The intent was to talk about pre-hospital, then switch to hospital, and then have this sort of integration piece. The speakers that were there, just real quick, on the hospital side, we had James Killen from UC San Diego, who spoke on their efforts. The hospital electronic health records and integration, Roland Phillips from Cerner spoke, and then Dr. Delbridge from the state of Maryland spoke about their work. From the pre-hospital side, Clay gave the overview of NEMSIS. Ben Frankel talked from PG County from their perspective and work and exchange. And a fellow who some of you know, Richard Hale from ESO, who's no longer at ESO, spoke on the overview of pre-hospital PCRs and some of the challenges that we've experienced. Again, he was speaking for the industry, not just for ESO. Dr. Gettinger, Andy Gettinger spoke. He led the panel of Lindsay Ferris, Greg Margolis, who a lot of you may know, and Scott Cluett, who made up the data exchange piece. And all of this information is available, including the slide decks that were presented if somebody's interested and wants to see them. The bottom line, the 130 people participated, then there were tons of time for questions. We had 30, 45 minutes at the end of each session, and we actually had a contractor come in, and they not only did minutes, but they did a full meeting summary. And then out of that came a PowerPoint called What We Heard. And that's the PowerPoint I'm going to walk through with you today, just to kind of hit on some topics, get some feedback, and then let you know that my intent was, when this report was finalized, it was held in January 20, so you usually give the contractors 30 days to put everything together. The idea was to have a summary back in March, which we did. But if you look at the timeline, we received the final draft of the report about a week before COVID just started devastating everything. So we're just now getting back to beginning to integrate a lot of these things on a large scale. However, I think we've checked off some of the things that we heard. So looking at the subcategories that are put together in this report, the first one was data integration. And it brought up some interesting questions. So what's the most important data? That was a big question. And really it came down to something we're going to talk about in a subsequent slide, which is, what is the outcome of this? What do you want to know? The talk about outcomes is interesting, but if you begin with the end in mind, what is your desired outcome? And what do you want to be able to say with that data once you pull it all back and synthesize it? Are you trying to sell value in your patient care delivery? Are you doing this for research purposes? Are you doing this for just strictly for billing purposes? That's a real key piece to understand up front. And that really drove a lot of the decisions in the development process for several of the systems that we heard and the speakers that we heard speak on what they did in beginning this process. There were a number of challenges identified with this, like where does the EPCR land in the electronic health record and in what format? I think there was a lot of belief from different parts of the participants that the electronic health record in a hospital was this thing that could basically take in discrete data and spit it back out, and we would give you element to element, and bang, it would be in this particular spot. And then everybody realized, hey, wait a minute, the systems are also all designed differently. So within the ER record, vital signs might be a part of patient history, but patient history might not include vital signs in somebody else's system. That even within the hospital industry, where we'll say a hospital chain all under one corporate body may not have the same data collection system in their emergency department throughout the whole system. So that was a learning experience very early on. Mapping from one standard to another and vendor to vendor was discussed quite a bit, and everybody agreed this is time-consuming work. The idea is to standardize it as much as possible. And one of the real intents there was so that each ambulance service in a state or in the country did not have to pay two vendors or pay multiple vendor or a vendor to develop and do the same thing that they just did for a hospital and ambulance company down the road. So in terms of data integration, you go to the next slide, Chris. In terms of data integration, there was a lot of discussion about whether the hospital would ingest it or whether we would simply push it to their record. And a lot of that discussion really went to the quality assurance piece. Do you want that human interaction to say, hey, this record truly goes with this patient? And that leads us to the UUID discussion, or at least part of the UUID discussion, but we'll come back to that. Culture and workflows, we've talked a little bit about that yesterday. The belief that maybe the pre-hospital data isn't as robust or complete as it should be, or the disinterest on the part of the hospital to participate, because now if we do this, they're going to want something back from us. There were a lot of very frank and open conversations throughout this meeting. It was very interesting. The data collected should be collected once, and then that data should be sent forward. There was quite a bit of discussion about receiving multiple reports on the same patient. And we talked about how that could happen, how that could be managed. A lot of these conversations are things that you guys have talked about for a long time. Technology's made it a little bit easier now for us to identify and specifically track individuals as opposed to just, grouping patients together from the scene of a motor vehicle crash under one single incident number, and that's all we know about the 5 or 6 people that were involved. And then we've had discussions here about additions to reports and modifications to reports. The whole sources of truth comment came out of the meeting many, many, many times. And that was when we have, 3 different reports or 3 different elements reported, which one do we take? Which is the actual one that we want? And what happens with updates also became part of the discussion as well. So if you go to the next slide, Chris, one of the things we took away from that was we had to do more training for not necessarily our folks, but the electronic health records vendors, the example, the Federal Health IT Coordinating Council. There's a group at NHTSA called Health and Transportation. Anywhere we had an audience where we could talk about how NEMSIS data, pre-hospital care data is collected, and then how that's delivered or could be delivered to a healthcare entity and what the benefits are of it, man, we were all over it. And we are still taking advantage of all of those opportunities. And we got to demonstrate a lot of that during COVID. So we've made some strides there, at least I think we have. Next slide, please. So the next piece of this, and I don't want to belabor the HIPAA part because we've talked about that quite a bit, but the 2 blue highlighted sections here were basically a big part of this discussion on the legal side and technical barriers. And it was no surprise, things we talked about yesterday, hospitals putting up barriers, EMS personnel not having the correct language for the ask, who are we speaking to at the hospital when we're making the ask, what we specifically need to know about HIPAA, and then, things like when we set up these agreements with the hospital and we as an ambulance service or agency take data back from hospitals, what are our requirements? And I think that's where when we asked Page, Wolfberg, and Worth to develop an imaginary barrier, how HIPAA promotes bidirectional patient data exchange with EMS, we specifically asked them to hit on that topic and make sure that an ambulance services realizes that when they take that data back to the hospital, they're held to the same standard that the hospital will be. So I think the 2 blue things, unless somebody else, and I know there's been talk about SAMHSA as well, and we're going to move down that road as well, but as long as somebody doesn't have a different request for HIPAA, I think we've put out as much as we need to put out on that particular topic. And I've kind of checked the boxes on these things. The software and technological limitations, the ability to segment electronic health records to share information that EMS has a right to know, that's an ongoing discussion with the EHR vendors, and that's going to be a sort of a time-consuming piece. Identifying the data that's minimally necessary, and I kind of hit on that a little bit yesterday with our discussion. Clay mentioned it as well with folks at ESO when we were presenting. Everybody says, well, what data would you like to share and what data would you like back? And man, that discussion opens up a big can of worms when people start to realize how much is out there. And that goes back to design with the end in mind. What are we really going to do with this? What are we trying to say when we get it back? So managing and accessing credentialing, that also is discussed a little bit in the bidirectional data exchange paper that Page, Wolfberg, and Worth has completed. I think that individual agencies will work that out, but I'm still of the mindset that there still needs to be somewhat of a training program for people taking this on. And if folks disagree, feel free to share that in the chats. The training program would be targeted at the agency data person. And for some folks, that's not a big deal because they're large agencies and they have a dedicated data person who understands the ins and outs and the legalities of all this. But for the smaller services that are now taking this on and they have access to just tons of data they've not had access to before, do they have policies in place for who should have access and to what parts they should have access and how it should be used? So I think one of the projects that I'm looking at for like a PWW in the future is a training program specifically for that. Next slide, please. again, these are just some examples of the products. You can go to the next slide, Chris. So along the lines of just general standards, multiple standards and families were discussed. At this point, we had not made the decision of using HL7 and using FHIR. So ONC at the time of this meeting, I'm 99% sure, correct me if I'm wrong, Clay, they did not at this point, they had not released their requirements for FHIR for hospitals. So we were still on the fence as to what was the direction to go. And we were having a discussion about these and then trying to determine which way was going to be beneficial for EMS. I think that part's worked out with Andrea and her work from ONC. We're going to have that developed one time, pay for it, and I'm correct. So ONC did not release their rule until after the meeting. So that was a big discussion, and that was a really kind of a sticking point for Clay and I. Is like, okay, that's a big decision. Which direction are we going to go, and whose standards should we follow? So NEMSIS has been a success in driving data collection nationally, but it doesn't ensure data exchange between pre-hospital and hospital environment. And that was a known, but that theme kept coming up so much that the contractor included it in the final presentation. So there's a need for standards around outcomes. I think you can look at that in terms of quality as well. NEMSQA has been talking about that. NAEMT has been talking about that. So standards change over time. And again, this concept of being agile and being able to change and meet multiple standards is, not meet multiple standards, but meet changing standards is critical. And I thought the last conversation was interesting in terms of compliance. There's a lot of discussion when we talk about compliance about the state custom elements. And it's interesting because, when I hear of custom elements, I just think that basically when 3 or 4 or 5 states adopt a similar or very same custom element, that to me is like a new version. It's certainly not a complete new version of like 3.6 or 3.7, but it tells me that there was a need to modify something that we have in existence, and we need to develop an agile way to do that. Go to the next slide, please. So the requirements, that's always a tricky one. We broke these out at the different levels based on the discussions, and the need for a deeper understanding of how EMS is integrated in the healthcare system from 911 through post-acute care is probably the duh of the whole meeting. It was like, yeah, that's been discussed numerous times in many different environments, and I think that's a foregone conclusion, and that's a tricky one to try to manage. But again, through constantly participating in meetings and participating with these groups that we've not worked with in the past, I think we can keep doing that. One of the things that you'll learn over the next couple years as we work with this project, my goal, and I've already asked some of the different vendors or state data managers or others to participate in meetings and present, like instead of me doing a NEMSIS, a 101 class, or Clay doing an overview of NEMSIS, is having the state data manager or having the state data or the agency data person do it from their perspective. So don't be surprised if I reach out and ask for someone to participate in a meeting and provide an overview of NEMSIS, especially from your perspective. To me, that's all a part of this kind of marketing. So we talked about showing patient interactions with limited information. How is that going to work when we share information, data to the electronic health record of the hospital, but we don't have what we consider to be key essential pieces? In other words, is the hospital just going to accept 3 of the 20 data elements that we've identified to exchange, and the other 17, those null them out? EMS standards, electronic health record standards developed independently, obviously. We are trying to work with ONC, who is looking at some national requirements. And it's interesting when we talk to some of our colleagues over HIE and specifically over at ONC about this last year, it sounds like a pretty easy process to say, well, the only data element that I want to give you from the electronic health record is one that's used on every patient every time. And then that list starts to get limited pretty quickly. We talked about patient matching as an issue. And of course, that's always been discussed, especially when we're talking about our sharing to CARES and to the trauma registries and other registries throughout the system. When we looked at it from the healthcare side, there was a need for better understanding of how clinicians could and would use the EMS system data, information, not just data. And again, that goes back to begin with the end in mind. You can go to the next slide, Chris, and that's basically just the UUID document. This is obviously not patient-specific matching, but we're looking at records matching, but it's certainly a start. Next slide, please. We talked a lot about change. There was another request for a clear documented authority. This came from HHS Office of Civil Rights on HIPAA rules. We decided that we would use a little different approach. That's one of the reasons we reached out to Page, Wolfberg, and Worth, thinking that we were going to get an answer and get an answer clearly written for EMS in a more timely manner than if we tried to go this route. There were models in the author of this slide deck thought that San Diego model was an example that others could follow. There were certainly other models that were discussed. And basically the lesson learned here was don't be an island of success. Don't try to recreate the wheel from your own perspective. And I think that the vendors have a huge role in that as they're asked to participate. And unfortunately, I think sometimes they're brought in at the end of the project instead of the beginning. Help align these people that are developing something new with people that already have success. I know sometimes that's a challenge because everybody wants what they want, but at the end of the day, it'll save them money and save resources. So the need to balance top-down requirements follows the discussion we had yesterday. Locals want something, agencies want something, the federal government wants something, but not all of those work together. And the burden ultimately lies with the person who's collecting the data and paying for that data collection, whether that's in time or for the system to develop it. So a lot of discussion there. Linking reimbursement to sharing the use of integrated data. In other words, if you don't agree to link your data, that was discussed. I think another one of the incentive pieces that didn't make it into the slide deck that I think should have was, I know that a lot of educational systems or a lot of states have requirements that if you're going to be a designated trauma center, then you have to allow EMS personnel to come in and provide or do clinicals. So that's another model that we talked about. So we're bringing you patients, we're transporting there, then you have to exchange data. And then linking Medicare and Medicaid funding, again, is the ultimate incentive. You can go to the next one. So the value propositions, and we talked about value a little bit, improving time-sensitive care, essentially closing the loop by providing timely feedback. And another comment that came out of this whole discussion that was very interesting is that we talk about timeliness of data from the perspective of gathering it, but there was only one brief topic of discussion on the timeliness of getting the report back to the individual agency or the individual clinician collecting the data on what actually happened either with that individual patient or what their success rates were on IV administration or the number of times they've seen a particular type of patient in a period of time. And the gist of the discussion was that needs to happen fairly quickly and not rely on someone to pull a report 6 months later. So improvements in education, research, and public health. Again, it all came back to the ability to reach out, be a part of the development process when people are developing plans, guidance, recommendations, and policy for electronic healthcare data collection, whether that's at the state, local, or federal level. And then you can go to the next slide. An example that I just put into that's our work with ET3. Certainly there's been value in not having the 205 people all have a different platform that they had to start with. So go to the next slide, please. So the emphasis on patient care and the data, there was the need for real-time communication. The focus here was on timeliness, making the right data and information available to the right person, to the right healthcare facility. It was interesting yesterday, one of the PWW team members mentioned your electronic health record with your primary care physician may not be with your cardiology specialist, may not be with your OBGYN. And that's the case. And that was a part of this discussion is, so where does this EPCR go? Does it just does it go to the hospital, or as part of an HIE, is it made available to all of the people who are associated with your particular care? And then ultimately, how does it get back to the patient? And this was a real interesting discussion, because I can go to CVS and get the information on my recent vaccine online, but can I get my recent ambulance transport narrative or data so that I have that as a part of my electronic healthcare record? Next slide, please. We talked about submission lag. I'm not going to beat this up, but again, this was a year ago and we're right on target with that discussion. Next slide, please. We set some goals. We talked about matching, and we talked about the fact that ONC had a report due to Congress on national patient identifiers and the ability to track patients. There was a lot of discussion here about patient integration, and it really came back to there wasn't specific law or guidance. It took us down the HIPAA road again, and I have to be honest, it really never got anywhere. Next slide, please. These were just, Clay covered these the other day, a couple of publications that supported the actual validity of the data. In case that was in question, you can go to the next slide. That was the participation in submissions, just to let the group know how big of a database we were talking about. And when I talk about this at DOT, it's usually like, look, 45 million records were submitted, over 35 million people accessed patient care in the United States last year through the 911 system. And then I'll just mention in closing, go to the next slide, please. If you look at, this is the COVID EMS by the numbers presentation that we had been doing since week 10 of the COVID report. And basically, this was what we were using recently to kind of tie all these findings together and say, hey, look, you know, if the hospital has this information, not only are they able to kind of track, but in some ways almost predict what's going to happen in terms of, you know, COVID. And if you were to look at the slide on the far left, the purple line at the very bottom, it is basically tracking lower than it was in 2020, thank goodness. But if you move out past the next line, it's basically following that same trend, and we're in an uptick. And at the end of this week, I suspect it will be up even higher. So this is just the example I put in there of some of the information that we heard that we're trying to move forward, not necessarily tied to the health information exchange, but to show how that data is actually being used in not a real-time basis, but in a more timely basis. So with that, I'll stop. I'll be happy to answer any questions. I'll certainly make sure that all of the information that was pulled from that meeting gets posted, including the slide deck that we walked through today. But a lot of ongoing work was generated out of that. And as I said yesterday, I'm looking at doing probably a telephone call to develop how we would do the next meeting. And then in March of 2022, hold an in-person and virtually as well meeting. That's the follow-up to the one in January. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Eric. This is Clay. Can folks see my screen okay?
Yep.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, great information, Eric. Great overview, and great chat going on as well related to some of the things you said, Eric. Thank you, Rachel, and others who are responding to that. We dig into that in greater detail after the quick lunch break. So let's continue to hold on to those comments regarding some of the issues regarding the release of data into HIEs. I think that will be incredibly valuable. We do have a 30-minute slot here where we want to try to cover a couple of pretty important topics that are high level, requiring a lot of feedback from you. So again, be prepared to share. Would love to hear from you. Want to talk about kind of the rollout of the standards. Mark mentioned this Do we need to reevaluate our timelines and things? This is where we're going to talk about this. So we want to dig in here pretty quickly. Really appreciate the comments by Steve Worth and others about the fact that EMS data has just grown in its understanding and perceived value with the pandemic. And these issues that we're going to cover kind of speaks to this, right? How do this renewed interest in the ability to actually use EMS data, pre-hospital data for surveillance and for other issues to capture data in a more kind of real-time fashion, and maybe even allow for there to be this quick transition to collect additional data. That all rolls up into this. So I'm just going to go ahead and dig in. One of the issues that we continue to fight with, and I know we go round and round about this, and always the discussion is incredibly helpful. So let's just revisit this again for maybe about 15 minutes, see if we can come up with some high-level thoughts or ideas that may be helpful here. So again, as we'll show in just a minute when we start talking about timelines, our versions of NEMSIS stay open for long periods of time, right? So 3.4 is scheduled to really be out for 8 years as it stands right now, with the increased rollout time and closure time that was extended at the beginning of the pandemic. And we're still catching our breath from that, right? I mean, I don't think we recovered. I don't even know if we're in a recovery phase yet. I think we're catching a breath phase and then holding our breath for what's going to happen this fall. So it's important to talk about this. But it was clear that we had a mechanism in place to develop custom elements. That was their whole purpose, right? Was to be able to have a standard that was available, but to allow for some variation that states may require. But the other idea was there may be things that come up. There may be a new procedure or medication that's now made available to EMS. How do we evaluate it? Can we add some custom values to kind of show that it's working or not working? The pandemic was a perfect example of that, where we early on wanted to add some custom elements to e-history to see who had traveled where, right, before kind of community spread was happening. But that came on, was incredibly important, and then when community spread happened, it was a mute point, right? So quickly. That's we built those custom elements. I think there were states that requested those. There were agencies that built them and made them, vendors who built them and made them available. That data, of course, never came up to the national level because it was not part of the national standard that was flowing up to us. And as Eric will attest, there was and there will be a call to potentially add elements to NEMSIS that would help us if we were to face another infectious emergency, right? I think that's going to happen. So I don't know. I wanted to throw this back out to the vendors specifically. I think you've struggled through this past year with us as well, and probably dealt with this highly variable requests from state to state. Has anyone kind of thought of perhaps some approach that we could take that would allow the standard to roll out on a more regular basis, that wouldn't be, I think it's considered so disruptive. And I think part of the disruption is associated with the fact that so much needed revision just piles up over 7 or 8 years before the standard is changed again. And maybe that burden wouldn't be so high if we came up with a process that worked a little better. And so I'm just going to throw that out. I've got a couple of ideas we can kind of talk about a little bit and see if there's value there, but I'd love to throw this out to the vendors and ask if you have had any thoughts about this. I know you folks have done some quick variable work associated with the pandemic, and I'm just wondering if there's any comments.
One thought I had, kind of models after the ET3. What if we had a special state set up for the COVID where we could define a set of custom elements, it gets collected in one spot and then distributed out to everyone while this need for making it to the national standard is evaluated and how that would happen.
Yeah, Scott, so let me flesh that out a little bit. Yeah, that was one of the ideas I wanted to kind of kick around here a little bit. I think what you're kind of saying is as there's this like call for national custom elements, right? And that could change if we develop something like this, Scott, right? We could also include some variables that states have already decided are important, right? And will be present in the next national standard, but could kind of exist in this state set. The only issue with that right now, Scott, is if we had custom elements that were shown to be valuable, we want them to become uniform, we put them into a state set. That data again would never get to the national level, right? So HHS or CDC, who wanted to track who traveled where early in the pandemic, for example, that data would not be available through a national data set.
Well, precisely, but if the state we created was an actual receiving entity that could take that data out and then pass it up the chain in this type of emergency situation. So we would basically create a new state and then we could collect that data and then distribute it.
Yeah, Scott. Yeah, I can see where you're going with that. Yeah.
And Clay, it looks like Dia had a kind of similar comment along those lines in the chat about how quickly the COVID elements evolved in creating a uniform standard in case this inevitably happens again in the future.
Yeah. Thanks, Dia. What happened early on in COVID was incredibly rapid and changing and evolving all the time. You're absolutely correct about that.
Quickly, this is Samantha BSO. I have a question. Is the intention that like the national level custom elements would become part of the standard? Is that going to be like something we can expect as a vendor?
Yeah, that's a great question, Samantha. And we talked a little bit about that early on in 2020. I don't think so. I think, and this kind of goes back to Dia's point too. I think a number of those elements that we developed jointly together, and we weren't as quick on the draw as we needed to be. So that was an important lesson that we learned and the Office of EMS learned. The construction or even the presence of some of those elements, I think probably wouldn't end up in a national element because they ended up being episodic. It proved that we could have done something better, right? We could have used a different approach that would have been better. So I'm not sure that those that are developed under such an emergency situation would automatically roll up, but I think the idea that Scott's talking about, Samantha, I think is if we reframed the idea around national custom elements as they serve as an in-between to major versions, then yeah, something like that I guess could happen.
Well, that's what I was was thinking about, is if this was our our in-between state, is there going to be a conversation when we go to the next version about whether or not to include them or not? Because some of the national elements, I see a really strong argument to include in the national standard, whether they go to the national level or the state level, but I think they should belong there. So, but I personally am in favor of using the custom elements at a national level instead of increasing the frequency of version rollout.
Thank you, Samantha.
Yep.
Peter, could you pop on? I apologize, Peter. don't feel like you're speaking too much. I'm not sure I completely understand your question about the existing elements in 3.5.
So I'm talking specifically about the custom elements. So, everybody's doing this development work to get certified for 3.5 and be ready for the next version. The question is, are we just rolling all existing custom elements into the next version, or is there going to be talk about deprecating ones that have been, added to the standard? If we're going to, talk about custom elements, let's not talk about them in, their isolated area where they are now, but also how they're going to be moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, I think this is just an idea right now, right? So I don't think there's any plan to do that. That idea may surface, and your other comment about other needed revisions, including deprecations or even removal of elements, right? That's associated with a move to a new standard. We can't just have a process in place. It's adding more burden, more data collection burden as we move forward. So yeah, that's a side of the coin that this approach doesn't directly address.
And
Hey,
I
this
feel
is
like
Josh.
that's sorry, go ahead, Josh.
In the boot camp for data managers last month, we did touch on changes that states will need to make for 3.5, and one of the topics on their list is to evaluate their state custom elements and decide which ones need to be kept in 3.5 and which ones can be retired. One example we used was that a lot of states have added some custom values to edisposition.12, and those will no longer be needed in 3.5. So yeah, every state will need to evaluate their custom elements and decide which ones to pull forward.
So we're all doing the development work right now. Is there any guidelines on, when we should expect to start seeing that?
I think I would refer to the polls that the NEMSIS TAC has done of both vendors and states on when they expect to be doing their transitions. So I know there's a list of all the states with some expected target dates for those states.
I think Peter brings up a good point about versions for custom elements, because they aren't version agnostic. They were created with a specific version in mind, and at least at the national level, we probably do need to address what versions the national custom elements apply to. I mean, offhand, it looks like the history ones would work for 3.5, but the D-Facility 01 custom element, I think that covers a change we added in 3.5, so that one, of course, wouldn't apply. So that's probably something we need to indicate, is which version the national custom elements apply to.
Yeah, we haven't yet published the national custom elements in 3.5, and I think we could do that pretty quickly.
Yeah, great comments, Peter. That's helpful. I better understand what you were asking. Jeff raises a good point too, that there could be a set of elements associated with for example, a like infectious epidemic, right, where it could be just a set of elements that are used when needed. I think that's true, but I think we're trying to maybe address a larger issue too, right? We already have needed or requested revisions for the 3.5 standard that we're continuing to collect, and we will continue to do that, and we need to decide when we implement those. So the custom elements, I think is a great idea. It does still, I don't know. I know, for example, the internal advisory board is going to be going through the standard as well, looking at the volume and quantity of elements that are collected, and are they all necessary? Those kind of things are happening, I think, with good intentions. And I'm just trying to, I'm still struggling though to see if there's a way to ensure that those changes can be made in a way that ensures that the national data reflect them, right? The biggest issue or one of the important issues that Eric will speak to is clearly Palantir, HHS, CDC was so interested in those additional custom elements and the data associated with them, but they weren't in any way collected at a national level. And any other thoughts? Would love to hear from states too regarding this issue. The rollout of these standards are disruptive as we currently kind of try to roll them out, and as the process that's in place, the education that we try to do. Do any of the states see a scenario where if we rolled things out more often and the revision was not as abrupt when we saved needed changes and reversions or revisions for so long? Is there a scenario that you can see as states that for other state data sets, for example, there's something that there's as a process we should consider and think about that's different from what we're doing?
Clay, this is Doug.
Hey, Doug.
I had to step away because of an issue here at our office, but I'm back, so I'm not sure what all you guys have covered. But have you talked about the variance that's going on too, instead of just what was a set COVID bug last year, so that you know that we are having a variant version of what we saw last year? And maybe that's not even important. You know, past history, you know, have you had COVID before? You know, those types of questions and all those sorts of things. And remember, when it gets to be big, it's going to be affecting counties and county health departments, you know, going up to the state, and it's just more stuff coming into the thing. So I think it's a good thing for EMS. Or I couldn't be here for the whole conversation, but that just kind of comes up in mind now, the new stuff that's coming.
Yeah. No, it's a good point, and it speaks to the question for sure, right? This will continue to be something that we have to work through, and there's even smaller things, right there. There's just a temporal need, right? I mean, micro mobility, the scooters in cities, and the just exponential number of injuries associated with those. That was kind of an easy fix. We were waiting on the CDC to come up with ICD-10-CM codes that would meet those requirements for reporting injuries to those things. But that's a good example of a federal organization that was able to handle that issue quickly, and that data comes up to the national level. So that worked out well. I think the inclusion of additional elements, or the reframing of an element, or even the removal of an element becomes a more difficult task.
Yeah, this is Josh. I've heard people say along the lines of, hey, how come, Microsoft Word can be updated so frequently and yet NEMSIS can't, or Gmail or whatever. I think that comparison is actually incorrect. Word is a product, Gmail is a product. They're like your ePCR products, which all of you vendors are updating all the time. The underlying standards on which they implement are updated very infrequently, actually. And it is hard to update a standard because it touches every product that uses it. But I wonder, we take, for example, ICD-10s, SNOMED, and RX norm, which we adopt by reference in the NEMSIS standard. And those data, lists of values is essentially what they are. They're updated anywhere from annually to twice a month, with new codes added and some codes deprecated or retired. And is it possible to find a process where we could make certain changes in the NEMSIS XSD standard that could be more frequent, whereas others would be more disruptive and we would make them less frequently? What I'm thinking of, for example, is that if we wanted to add, let's say, provider's immunization history, and we want to add COVID as an immunization that a provider has had. Adding a value to an existing element that's already a coded list is a backwards compatible change. In other words, data that's created in the older version is still valid in the new version. Once you update to the new version, now you're able to track that new value and provide that. That's a little different than saying we're going to retire edisposition.12 and replace it with 4 new elements. That's a much more disruptive change. At the end of the day, I realized that every change is a change and it disrupts something. But wanted to throw that out. Is there some path by which we could say, hey, maybe we can be a little more nimble at adding stuff to the standard, and but more careful about things that are structural changes?
This is Samantha with ESO again. And I think additions to things like history lists, medications, flowcharts, things that there are code bases we're already using is fairly innocuous. And I know there's already a custom element extension for COVID in the immunization list. What I would be concerned about is if we've made a blanket statement like that, and then someone comes in and says, well, we want to add a value to one of the disposition lists. And that would cause a huge problem to our business logic. Even though it sounds fairly innocuous, hey, we're just updating a list value.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. It certainly depends on the element.
It does.
Because if you're looking at a disposition type element, you got a bunch of validation rules around it. And now you got to consider that new value and all those validation rules.
Right.
Yeah, great feedback, Caitlin and Peter. Really, really helpful. Well, I'm glad we talked about it briefly. I think there'll be lots more discussion about this as we kind of move forward, and it speaks to a little bit about what Doug said, right? Whether we're actually going to be able to take the deep enough breath to actually look at this or in depth, or if we're gonna over the next couple of months be back kind of mired in the initial issue. We'll kind of see how that pans out. I apologize we have to move on so quickly, but I want to make sure that we can get everything covered, and then we can come back to this on our calls. I want to talk a little bit about the 3.5 timeline. So both vendors and states have asked us to revisit this. We thought we would just hold those requests until we came together here. There's 2 polls that we'll be taking, so everyone will have an ability to kind of vote on this, and we'll see the results of that poll. We're going to be talking about whether we're extending the closure date for 3.4, and then whether we do any changes to the implementation dates of 3.5 that are already in place. Both of those have lots of different connotations associated with each of them, so we'll kind of walk through those. Eric spoke a little bit about the work that we've done just to continue to try to work with vendors and with states to kind of keep up to date as to what they're thinking as regards to their timeline for transitioning to 3.5. So this is available on the website under the 3.5 revision tab. You can go ahead and look at these lists. We'll try to keep these as current as we possibly can. You can see it looks like there'll be a very busy 4th quarter of this year, 3rd to 4th quarter as vendors come in. And then you can see that there's lots of states that are also trying to meet the current timeline, and they'd love to transition with the end of this year, same quarter. And clearly there's some in 2022. And if you look at the entire list, there's also a lot of states that it's to be determined, right? As we've talked about, many states just haven't taken the time yet, of course, to kind of formulate their process. So when you look at these lists, we are trying to bunch up, right? We're trying desperately to meet the current timeline, and we're hoping that things will turn around quickly, right? And the developments will be able to happen quickly. Let's talk about both of these kind of individually. So let's talk about are there rational reasons for us at the national level to keep the 3-4 data open later than the first month of 2023, right? So it's basically, if those timelines that we just talked about, so the implementation of software becomes available in the fourth quarter of this year, it really provides a year for the total transition for states, and then to be able to close down 3-4. So any comments about whether or not we need to extend that? Okay, this is always a balance, right? The states rely on the Office of EMS providing these deadlines to help things progress forward, right? So we don't want just to extend this indefinitely, but let's just collect some quick comments about this. Do folks feel like there are rational reasons to extend this or to hold?
Clay, I'm not sure if you're able to see the chat, but Mark has a comment about with the number of agencies in California and having to collect new DEM files and then test and verify each DEM file for almost 1,000 agencies. He's anticipating that taking almost 3 years.
Almost 3 years. Yeah, good comment, Mark. Other states have thoughts? All right, what about the vendor side? Okay, well let's just take a poll and see what people are. Chris, can you bring up the poll in regards to whether or not we should extend the closure date for 3-4? So it's just a simple yes or no poll. Should we extend the closure date for 3-4? Let's kind of see where we are with this. Yeah, feel free to go ahead and vote too if you're, if you have multiple people from a software company or from a state. We're not trying to make the denominator represent anything here. We're just trying to get everybody's opinion on the call. So feel free to vote. Okay. Okay, fantastic. So really 2/3 to 1/3. That isn't as stark as I thought it would be. So let's end that poll, Chris, and save those numbers. Let's move quickly to the other poll. We have just a couple of minutes here. I want to make sure that we can get to this. So let's talk about what we've done or just provided these landmark locations, right, for 3-5, and when we kind of expect the states to be moving. I think states look at this closely when they're planning their timelines. There's not going to be broad market availability by August of 2021. We could have the majority of implementations available or the software available by the beginning of 2022, based on the information that we have collected and tried to keep updated by the vendors. But as Mark indicated, there is time for states to kind of roll out and make make that implementation active. So again, let's do the second poll here, Chris, if you would. So should we extend these milestones, kind of providing for more space for market availability and for the majority of implementations across the country, kind of setting milestones for states to make decisions? Great. We have a higher proportion of an affirmative response here. That's really helpful. Okay, great. Very, very helpful in those polls. Thank you very much. I've got one more simple piece I wanted to just bring up, and I'd love to hear from states just in the last couple of minutes. We have about 2 minutes left. There's we've been toying with the idea of we probably need to modify the format and the process whereby we're generating our data dictionary, and wanted to just get some quick comments, and happy to, if you wanted to share them in the chat, or if you'd like to speak up, would love to hear from you. Is there value when we're reevaluating this process to provide some way for there to be a shareable version of the data set that we develop for states to utilize, or to be able to build on their data dictionaries? We've been reticent to do that because we feel like if we were to provide this, for example, in an editable format, and a state was to add an element, to a national, or add a value to a national element that really is a custom element, not part of the national standard, that could be confusing for researchers and for people utilizing the data set, our clinicians. And so we've been reticent to do that in the past, but we could certainly try to think of a process to make this more helpful. Yeah, thank you, Jay. Appreciate your comment. Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you, Anne. Thank you, Ritzy, Brenda. Yeah, other states, if you have an opinion here, that would be incredibly helpful. We're glad to think about how we can best modify this process to support you as well. And feel free to continue to provide comments. And if the vendors have an opinion here, yeah, please also go ahead and share your comments. Ben, I think I'm bumping right up against my time. Thank you, folks, for your comments. We'll take these back and certainly revisit these during the next year.
Yeah, thanks, Clay. And yeah, like Clay said, you can continue to put comments in the chat if that's helpful. We're going to take a, let's see here, about a 13-minute break or so. And then when we come back, we will talk with Andrea Forquet about HIE interoperability and some Connectathon information. So we will see everyone back here at 11:40 Mountain Time, and I think that's going to be 1:40 Eastern. Right. Well, thank you. And we are going to actually turn things over to Andrea Forquet and her team to talk about HIE and data interoperability and some Connectathon information. So Andrea, if you're all set to go, I will hand it off to you to introduce your team.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrea Forquet, and we'll just have a moment while we pull up the slide. I work with IHE USA with ONC for a fire initiative, and my two colleagues are Adam and Katia, and we're going to go through this slide deck to discuss IHE and Connectathons, and we'll hopefully have enough time at the end to answer some questions as well. So we'll start with Adam and the slides.
Thanks, Andrea. You're able to see the slides?
I can see them.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you all, and we really appreciate this opportunity. We'd like to thank everyone, one, for the really important work that you all do every day to help bring urgently needed care to all of our communities. And we also appreciate you taking time out of your schedules to attend this event and attend this session. So thank you. All right, so today we're going to provide a short overview of IHE USA and the role that it plays in advancing standards adoption in the US. We'll explore common interoperability challenges that you all face every day, and we will review a number of EMS-focused resources that IHE has developed to support your work. And finally, describe a few ways that you and your organizations can get involved with IHE's efforts to improve health data interoperability. So what is integrating the healthcare enterprise, which is also known as IHE? IHE is a standards development organization. It's based in the US with affiliates around the globe. It's a standards integrator using a common technology framework to coordinate the adoption of standards to meet clinical and administrative use cases for the seamless, secure exchange of health data. It's an interoperability testing platform, an open source end-to-end test management platform with over 20 interoperability conformance testing tools and test partner matching all in one location that enables health IT developers to test production-ready systems to ensure that they can deliver on the promises that they've made to their customers of impactful interoperability. It's also a global community with engineers and health IT developers across 4 continents focused together on the deployment of interoperability innovation based on the effective coordination of health IT standards. So let's talk a little bit about what composes IHE. IHE is comprised of several topic-focused domains that we see here in the center. These domains work to develop and maintain integration profiles, also known as implementation guides, for specific parts of healthcare delivery. Finally, IHE is composed of IHE International and affiliate deployment committees across the globe, and we can see here the breadth of the global reach of IHE, both within the United States and throughout the world. The role of these deployment committees is to focus on nation-based support for interoperability deployment activities. And to explore that a little further, we hope to spend a moment just exploring the relationship between IHE International and IHE USA. In terms of how the two organizations work, IHE USA leverages IHE International's common technical framework and to customize to meet that framework to meet the unique needs of the US healthcare industry. Utilizing IHE International's interoperability testing platform, IHE USA hosts a North American Connectathon each January to provide interoperability testing and test partner matching services to both public and private health IT developers. And leveraging IHE International's global community and relationships with other standards development organizations, IHE USA builds upon shared global best practices to accelerate the adoption of health IT standards to achieve US-focused policy goals. So to explore a little further the relationship between IHE International and IHE USA in their work to improve the quality, value, safety of healthcare by enabling the rapid, scalable, and secure access to health information at the point of care, we hope to share a bit about our continuous development and deployment cycle. So this cycle begins, and as we're looking at this slide, the components that are shaded red are components where IHE International takes the lead within that process, and the components in the blue represent the space where IHE USA and our respective colleagues in domain deployment committees around the world the activities that they participate in. So the process starts with health IT developers, providers, and other stakeholders working with IHE International volunteers to craft an interoperability problem and potential solutions to share with IHE International's groups call for proposals. These proposals are reviewed on a quarterly basis. Those proposals then move forward and are developed into are the source and the seed of profiles that are developed by the appropriate domain committees for inclusion into IHE's overall technical framework. Once those profiles are developed, IHE International then releases those profiles for public comment. We respond to those comments with revisions to the profiles and then make the profile available for trial implementation. From there, as mentioned, IHE USA picks up the baton. Testing activities for those profiles take place at IHE USA's North American Connectathon event, and those results of the testing is shared through IHE International's product registry. Those newly tested profiles are then demonstrated at the HIMSS Interoperability Showcase, which is held every year at the HIMSS Global Conference. And that demonstration is designed to drive adoption of the profile in the wider industry through local activities that are then supported at the deployment committee level. Now I will turn our presentation over to Andrea Forquet, Chair of IHE's Patient Care Coordination and Quality Research and Public Health Planning and Technical Committee.
Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Andrea Forquet, and what we'll be talking about is kind of how the projects that we have in IHE are looking to help some of these interoperability challenges that we are aware of for EMS. These are just a few off of our knowledge, but we understand that there are many levels to these challenges. But the main ones that we're looking at are the overlap in the data, the multiple standards, and the distinct workflow of EMS in general, and siloed information. And these are well, siloed and proliferated medical connections of medical devices. And these challenges are very similar to the challenges that IHE and the standards development in healthcare look to also solve. And so IHE has spent many years developing transactions, profiles, messaging to help find these solutions to these problems. And so within IHE, they have developed some of the EMS standards that can help with these challenges, and hopefully additional challenges that that may not necessarily be connected to the data exchange of data, but can be improved with interoperability. So we'll go to the next slide, next few slides where we'll be going a little bit more into detail with this. And so mainly the main piece of these standards is the connectathon. The connectathons are used to continue to develop those standards and is kind of that last piece of the puzzle of the rapid development cycle that IHE has. And so at the end of profile development, we'll test that profile at Connectathon, and hopefully by the end we can either say that it's good and our systems were able to exchange the data in the defined way that sorry.
This is Adam. I do think we may have lost Andrea's sound.
Okay.
And let's see, did she? Looks like she may have dropped. So we can, as she is continuing to dial in, we can speak to the information she was going to share about our Connectathon. So As Andrea mentioned, it is that final step in that rapid development process. We really pride ourselves and as an organization on the breadth of relationships that have been able to be built vendor to vendor, organization to organization at our connectathons that have been going on over the past 20 years. And the goal of the connectathons is to provide a structured, collaborative environment to rigorously test software and hardware solutions. In my 20 years in health IT, I've really never seen anything quite like it in terms of seeing organizations that may appear to be in a competitive position to one another, sitting side by side, collectively working through problems that integration and interoperability problems that would have taken months to resolve, would involve on-site travel to clients. One person mentioned that 3 months worth of that testing process can be resolved in 10 minutes at the Connectathon. It's really no other event offers the scale and breadth of.
Wanda was looking for some name tags.
I'm sorry, if you could mute your lines. Oh, wonderful. Andrea, are you back on the line?
Yep, I just got back on.
And I just want to acknowledge the question in the chat that says, who can we contact for the European Connectathon? I think it's fair to say that you can at least start with Emily, and then we'll make sure you get to the correct person.
Yes, that is fair. Emily helps arrange everything, and IHE USA does have some involvement with the European Connectathon as well. So she will know who to connect you to as well. And I apologize very much about dropping off there. So the next few slides, we're going to discuss the profiles that have been developed in IHE that are specific to EMS care. And the first one is the paramedicine care summary, and that is the document that is going to be distributed from the ambulance to the hospital ED during transit or after transit, depending on how you develop that standard. And it defines the data that will be passed between those two systems in FHIR and CDA document formats. And this one is a very important piece of interoperability because it does help with more informed patient care, less dependency on verbal handoff, to have the receiving location prepare for the patient's arrival, and gathering the patient data when that time that is used in verbal handoff can be utilized towards that patient care. And this specification was recently updated to reflect the NEMSIS 3.5 update, and there's a hyperlink within this document that will take you to the most updated version. Since it was newly developed, it is still going through that publication process, and it will be the newest version will be up and published, but you will be seeing the version that this link will bring you to. And because this is an active work item, it is in trial implementation. That means that it's ready to be tested whenever you want to test it. And it's also, because of the continuous cycle, you're able to review it and provide additional comments on this document and on refining the data, pointing out any issues that may be seen within it, and informing me, because I'm the author of these specifications, and there will be a change proposal that will happen to update that that document to a more refined document. And then the best way to go through this would to be involved in the development is go to the Connectathon, which is a very important step. Like I was saying before, this is where we really test out the system to really see how the profile helps you connect to an EHR system. And because the Connectathon because the format of the Connectathon, you're able to get that connection with an EHR and be able to test that data flow. And then the next profile will be the referral document. And that referral document is, it has to do with the transfer of information from within the hospital to an EPCR device, essentially. And this will handle how the patient data comes out of the hospital, what patient information needs to go needs to be coming out of the hospital to help populate that patient care document, and insurance information, etc. And those have the defined mappings and how to get the EHR data into a readable format for the EPCR. Also, this is also in FHIR and CDA format, so you're not forced to do either CDA or FHIR, whichever development is easier. And it's very similar on how to get involved. Review the document, see if there's any issues, come back and give me comments, and then also test it, and try to test it at the Connectathon as well. This testing might be a little bit easier to carry out compared to the paramedicine care summary, because it has a lot to do with the consuming of data instead of structuring it. But this is also an important piece of that patient care puzzle, because a lot of ambulance systems do act as an interfacility care transport. And then on the next slide, we will discuss the final EMS related profile in IHE as of now, which is the quality outcomes reporting for EMS. This has to do with the e-outcomes section in NEMSIS. It is heavily based on it, but it can be utilized for more than just the e-outcomes reporting. And so, but this takes the quality metrics, the patient outcomes that reside within the hospital, that an EMS system usually will never have access to, be able to get, but this profile will help send out that data from the hospital EHR to either an HIE or whoever they need to send out that quality metrics reporting to for the patient, so you can close that care loop, so we can get essentially the quality metrics of the patient care during their transport. And this is very, like I said, we would like this to also be tested within IHE Connectathons, because this is also dynamic as well. So you can use the structure of this report to report things more than just e-outcomes. You can report stroke measures and trauma, and it has a few extra transactions in there so that you can either query a hospital for the patient outcomes, or you can retrieve that from an HIE, or it can be a push or a send from a hospital to the receiving ambulance system that has not requested, but needs to get the outcomes for the patient care. This is only in FHIR, so this is not a CDA transaction or profile, but it's also a very important one because, you know, this is what helps inform the training and quality of care for the patient. And the question in the chat is that we are not connected to the HL7 connectathons, but IHE is a different step of testing. So HL7 connectathons tend to be more specification testing, very developmental level of a profile, whereas IHE connectathons, while it also can be utilized to test out the profiles that are developed, it is actually a development testing environment, essentially. So many of the systems that do go to Connectathon are planning to or using that event to certify their systems, as they're trying to certify that they adhere to certain profiles. So it's more of a rigorous testing than the HL7 connectathons. And I hope that answers your question. The next slide, please.
Andrea, there was another question in the chat about changing the name because the acronym might relate to something that's commonly used in the industry. And I think the answer to that would be that we welcome those type of comments. And those are things that are discussed in the domain committee meeting, but did you want to add anything else to that?
Yes, so the titles of these profiles are currently able to be changed if they need to be, because they're not as well known or in being used as of now. A title change could be very easy to do in a change proposal. So we can have an additional discussion on that and additional recommendations on what the profile should be named. So you're welcome to email me and we can discuss that, because I would like to continue to make sure that the acronym isn't mistaken for something else. But yeah, and I hope that helps. So the additional, going on in advancing public health and cross-border care is we have a white paper going on about that is going to go through the process of informing the standards that can be utilized for EMS testing and standards development in relation to the current healthcare standards that exist in IHE and I believe some HL7 as well. And so this one's for more of a awareness and kind of to start the discussion that many of the interoperability problems that EMS is facing currently do have healthcare standards solutions within IHE and HL7. So things like HIE connecting to an HIE through standards, connecting devices through standards, you know, cross system sharing, or amongst like organizations within EMS is also something that is looked at. You know, we have patient privacy, patient IDing, pieces like that will be hopefully, you know, defined within this document to help bring some awareness, a little bit more guidance on what everyone in the EMS ecosystem here can be utilizing to assist this connection with the healthcare. And so because this white paper has just gone through the proposal approval stage, it's in development. So the first few drafts are being developed now and will be presented at the weekly PCC meetings that take place within IHE. And so you could do two things if you would like to get involved with that development. It is you can attend some of the weekly meetings and assist in the development of the document as the drafts are being presented, or you can provide a comment to the document when it's completed in going through the public comment space. And you can do either, and any comments or any involvement is welcomed and very much appreciated as well, because that's what's going to help inform this document and make it as relatable to the community as we can. And so if you're interested in participating in those meetings, you can contact Nicole Knox, who is one of the meeting managers, and she can get you a meeting invite as well. There, just for some awareness, those meetings are not restricted to the EMS project. There are 2 other projects going on that don't necessarily connect to EMS, but if you want to be involved in the development, again, that is very welcomed. Your feedback can be and experiences are probably important to some of the discussions, but again, they, if you come in, there will be a weekly agenda that will be sent out so that you know when the EMS piece is being presented. All right. And I believe we're going to go into the next steps of all of this, which is Connectathon. And we have there's a lot of information about Connectathon, with pairing partners, with how to get started, with signing up, with going to some work sessions and starting some work session development, so that you're not on the testing floor without a plan. These things will continue to be discussed in the next few months, and there are some additional events that might discuss it, but you can also reach out to me personally on my email right there to have further in-depth conversations about what exactly those work sessions will look like, or how to get involved in them, or even scheduling some one-on-one sessions about what you would like to have for your system specifically. What you can also do is you can help assist with the development of the IHE profiles. We have a few profiles coming in and out every year, and just because they're not EMS focused doesn't mean that EMS cannot potentially use the profiles in the future, and feedback on that during committee meetings and development is very important, and it's something that we want to have and we want to hear from this community. We want to bring you guys to the table of development, so that if anything, if you guys have more profiles that you want to develop, more specific use cases and workflows that you want to work out within the standards field, we would like, we welcome those work items, and you can bring them. You can, as Adam was going through the development cycle, you can write up a proposal. You can reach out to me about writing up a proposal, and I can show you how to do it, and I can kind of help you through the whole process if you need to continue involvement and continue development of standards. Continuing the development of these EMS profiles, again, like I want to get as many eyes on these as possible. I want to see what could be improved with them. because I really would like I would really like them to do what they're intended to do. And it can only really help with having everybody in the development fields come back and help give the feedback. And then, you know, we also have a bunch of resources on our IHE site in general too. You can go, we have the links here. There are many other profiles that you might find relevant to certain use cases or workflows in EMS, or maybe they're not quite as detailed and you would like to speak up on that. You're welcome to go through the different domains and the profiles that reside in them to really see what IHE is doing and what it has to offer you, and what you can offer it for improvement on these current standards as well.
All right, thank you so much, Andrea. This has been really good, and looks like their contact information is on the screen as well. We're gonna kind of quickly transition over to ONC to talk about US core data for interoperability and certified health IT. Al, if you're ready to go, we can queue you up and let you present your slides.
Sorry, this is Al. I had to step away for a second. Were you guys, I'm assuming you guys are, it's my turn.
Yep, we're all set for you.
I apologize for that. I had to step out for just a second and tell somebody something. I'm gonna share my screen. And, okay. All right. Not many people know who I am, at least on this call. My name is Al Taylor. I'm a medical informatics. Been doing informatics for the last 10 or 15 years or so. I'm here to talk today about the US core data for interoperability. That is a standard data set that ONC puts out, and we'll talk a little bit about how it applies to the EMS, and have some time for plenty of time for questions at the end. So, like I said, this is the USTDI is a data set or a standard data set that ONC defines, and it's used by certified health IT or certified EHRs. And those data must be collected, have to be collected by certified EHRs using a specific set of standards. So labs have to be, systems have to be able to capture laboratory data using low-ink codes, for example, and capture problems with SNOMED codes, things like that. So the USTDI is a set of data with defined standards in many cases. It's also, we also pay attention to this concept of a core data set. It is not all patient data. It is not all patient data needed for all different use cases, but it is a core set of data that ONC requires that systems be able to capture and exchange between systems using a couple of different methods. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Each of the data elements are organized in data classes, but the data elements themselves are discrete concepts that represent specific concepts within healthcare, things like medications and allergies, a procedure or a health concern, all different kinds of data, but these are all different concepts represented by different codes in particular. So, like I said, some of these have to be expressed using specific codes like SNOMED, low-ink, RX norm. But others where there's not a broad consensus about what's the absolute best vocabulary to use, that's left to be defined by either the individual users, individual developers, or depending on how the data are exchanged, the vocabulary that's required for that particular exchange method, like CCDA or FHIR, those requirements override any requirements that are part of USCDI. And also USCDI is what we call standards agnostic or exchange standards agnostic. The data elements that are within USCDI that are invoked by those other exchange methods, the USCDI doesn't specify exactly how those other exchange standards use the data, only that they have to be captured and made available within and between systems. For those who are familiar, this may be a reminder or a refresher, but the way that ONC certifies health IT in general is by a set of criteria that these are functional criteria that systems have to be able to meet and are tested and are certified that they are able to meet these criteria in specific ways using specific test methods and validated to their conformance to the standards. The standards, these are criteria these are the 6 criteria that ONC has currently on the books that systems have to conform to, where the data set of USCDI is a reference standard set. So the first one is a new one. These are the other 5 are updated criteria, but the first one is the exchange of information using standardized application program interface, or API, using the FHIR US core standard. And the others are updates, and the previous versions of these criteria used a data set called the Common Clinical Data Set, and that Common Clinical Data Set evolved from an even earlier version called the MU, or Meaningful Use data set. And those may be familiar to some people, but that has always been a set of data that really are considered to be the must-haves in systems in order to meet, initially they were required to meet CMS requirements for CMS reporting in early meaningful use, and then evolved into other uses, including specific exchanges between systems. And these are the criteria that reference USCDI. And so when USCDI is implemented and when USCDI is updated, they're updated through the use of the data in these criteria. That's how we test or prove that systems are updating to the new data correctly. So we recently published, early July, we published the 2nd version of USCDI. And these are the data elements and data classes that are required to be collected and then later exchanged between systems. We did add a few new data classes and data elements to the version 1 of USCDI. USCDI version 1 added a number of different data elements compared to the Common Clinical Data Set. And a couple of things to point out, without going into too much detail about each of these. The systems who update to V2 will now have the capability of exchanging more detailed information about the care team member, and that care team member can include a credential provider. It could include other members of the family or caregivers. It can also include other members of the care team, including support staff within the hospital, or even outside the hospital as well. We added new data classes around encounter information, and encounter information and location runs the gamut from pre-hospital to hospital, and post-discharge locations for encounters. We also added new data classes around clinical tests for things like EKGs. Sometimes functional tests can fall into this category. Diagnostic imaging, obviously, we previously did not have data element specifically around the diagnostic the imaging tests or the results. Of note, the diagnostic image file itself is not a requirement in USCDI, and so that no longer that is not a requirement for to be able to capture and exchange the image file itself, but only the reports. The other thing of note that we added really as a move to improve the ability to capture data around healthcare inequities and disparities is we added several new data elements around sexual orientation and gender identity. We also added a number of different data elements related to capturing data around social determinants of health. Those are used in a lot of different clinical workflows. And now systems will be able to capture specific data around SDOH. It doesn't indicate that that data has to be collected at the point of care, only that the systems be able to handle that information should the workflow dictate that information be collected. Now that we've updated USCDI version 2, it's important to note that it's not yet available. It's not yet officially available for updating their systems. We hope that it will be soon, but because USCDI as a new standard version, it has to go through what we call the standards version advancement process, and that is a regulatory instrument that we use at ONC to allow systems who are certified to specific versions of standards to update to a newer version of standards prior to the SVAP, as we call it. Systems actually were not allowed to update and field version updates, even if something were to be updated between when they certified and when they needed to provide that to customers. But we hope that the USCDI version 2 does, it's ONC that does the approving of the SVAP and the updated standards, but should USCDI v2 be added, then systems will be able to update to be able to capture and exchange all of those new data elements. In order to help facilitate that, ONC works very closely with HL7, in particular the US Realm Steering Committee, who are responsible for making the appropriate updates to the FHIR US Core implementation guide, as well as the CCDA template IG that is currently undergoing updates in order to accommodate the new data in version 2. As far as the timeline goes, like I said, we just published version 2 in July. We are now accepting submissions for recommendations of new data elements and new data classes for inclusion in version 3. That submission period, and it could include anything from any stakeholder group, is ongoing through the end of September. And then, like we did last year, ONC takes some time to evaluate all of those submissions and decide which of those submissions ought to be included in a new version of USCDI. And then we'll go through the same cycle that we did this year with evaluating the draft that we put out and then considering whether or not we should make changes to that draft before we publish the final, again, about this time next year. And again, the last piece to this is USCDI version 2 will be considered for updating using the SVAP, which will allow it to be implemented. And then we go through that cycle on an annual basis to consider USCDI and other versions for update into for systems to update to the new version. We talked about the submission period now through September. ONC is working with stakeholders who are contemplating doing submissions or who have already done submissions in the past, in order to make sure that all of the information needed for us to fully evaluate these data elements are included in the submission. Once we have all those submissions, ONC then has to select amongst all of the all of the candidates for addition. And in order to help with making sure that those submissions are as high quality as possible, we encourage folks to work with other stakeholders who have similar data requirements in order to combine forces, if you will, so that those data elements are not duplicated and that they get full consideration for inclusion. We've been working with a number of different stakeholders, both inside the federal government and outside, in order to help shape those submissions into something that we can work with better. And if you're interested in reviewing or actually doing submissions, whether it's an organization like NEMSIS or individual stakeholders, this is the portal through which we accept all submissions in the for consideration for USCDI. We can take we take a look at those. We give them all kind of a rating of how mature they are, and then make a decision about which of those are going to be included. And all of the submissions are published and available for review by anyone in the public to go and see what we had said about previous submissions and what we're saying about current ones. And then other people can come along and contribute to those submissions just to make them better for our consideration. The way that ONC goes through the process of selecting amongst those submissions for addition to USCDI, we obviously want data elements that are feasible to implement. So that means are already developed regarding the health IT standards, at least significant development of the implementation guides, and they don't have to be the implementation guides that I mentioned earlier. They could be an implementation guide, for example, the EMS PCR implementation guide could be a foundation, is certainly a foundation for one way of implementing, at least using CCDA or CDA. But we're looking for those that don't require a lot of development of those standards. We also are looking for a fairly modest set of new data elements to add each time, because we want health IT systems to adopt each version. It's voluntary, but we still want we still want systems to be able to implement these and provide those updates to the customers, because we think that the value is in the availability of those data to the customers. And this year, when we published our version 2, we also published some additional criteria that we are going to use to select amongst data elements. And those include data that specifically addresses healthcare inequities, and data that are used to help support those who are in underserved communities, along with specific data that's unique, possibly unique or shared by the public health community, including reporting, investigation, and emergency response. Those are the slides that I have. I just wanted to, if we're fielding questions, I can put in a couple of websites or URLs to where to find out more information about USCDI and the system to update to make submissions for the next round of USCDI. So I'm going to stop there. I haven't had a chance to look through the chat and see if there's questions for me about the chat. Doesn't look like there are, but I can open it up for questions now.
Yeah, Dr. Taylor, this is Clay. Thank you. Great presentation. Appreciate that overview of the USCDI. Could you speak a little bit to understanding the pre-hospital environment, how you think EMS and health information exchanges, how pertinent it is that we our process of collecting data should be represented in the US CDI. Is there, will there be requirements for that? Or should we not worry too much about it? Right, when we look through the US CDI version to it, it's clearly more robust, but it still doesn't capture some of the attributes of pre-hospital care, right? Should we be really making a strong effort to ensure that those particularities associated with pre-hospital care are represented in version 3?
I think it's worth a look. When I think about pre-hospital data, and as somebody who worked in a hospital, occasionally in an ER, but mostly in a hospital and a clinic, there's very often the data that come in through EMS. It would be great to have. It's not always available. Quite often, it's not available. I think that so I think it would be valuable to have some of those data available. Whether those data are different in whether they constitute a different. So we have these general categories like problems or encounter diagnosis or procedures or labs or tests. We have those general concepts which could, in many cases, be able to capture a lot of the information that EMS produces. So it could go into that bucket of problem or diagnosis or lab or test. And so it's just a matter of whether or not those particular codes that represent the specific EMS data, the specific EMS tests or diagnosis lists, if those are able to be represented. So ONC and USCDI doesn't specify how those data are collected. What we're doing is providing these categories for the data to land when they are connected, so that when we go to look for those data for exchange with other providers or other levels of care, we know where to look for that. And if the EMS data comes in and is able to be imported into an ED record, then we would know to look for, an impression in maybe a problem list that would, and any data that comes in and is bucketed into that problem list would be able to be exchanged and reviewed. And some data that's collected from EMS, it's clear that it's collected by EMS and not some other place in a hospital. Others, whether it was a regular test or a standard test that's done, it would need to be, we would need to make it clear that that was collected prior to admission or prior to ED. So I think that where there are unique data elements that are really only primarily used in EMS, these sort of, I would call them buckets or classes of data that are usually only collected by EMS, but still are valuable to the continued care for the patient. I think that those would be good additions to USCDI. It certainly would be worth a look. And because we are focusing on the core data, it could be that some data that happen in certain settings aren't necessarily core to the entire spectrum of care. But that's something that we can look at and then get feedback from the community. We know where EMS stands on it. What is the emergency department community? What is the inpatient community or ambulatory community think about the potential burden of adding new data elements to USCDI, because systems that update to the next version of USCDI are going to have to update to everything in USCDI, not just the things that meet their specific data requirements. That makes sense.
That's helpful. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Yeah, I'm trying to think through this a little bit. Yeah, this is Clay again. So we and as we spoke over the email, we maintain an ANSI approved CDA that kind of tries to move the provides a mechanism for the exchange of data, for example, from an ambulance to an emergency department, right? So that EPCR can go across. That document, as it's currently specified, includes most of the information that is included in an EPCR, right? So it does include things like, I don't know, times and, was the transport to the hospital lights and sirens versus not, right? Those items seem like under this new standard that those probably shouldn't be here because they're not directly related to the care of the patient. Is that a correct assumption?
I think that's up. Maybe that it could be that could be a fair assumption. I think that one of the components as I was reading, and to be fair, I don't know that much about these about the whole EMS care system, but looking at some of the capabilities to use those data around quality measurement around EMS care, that sounds more being able to use data, any available data in order to perform quality care is a valuable additional use case for the need for data, whether it's in the EMS setting or the surgical setting or the ambulatory care setting. And so to say that the data primarily would only be used for the EMS data, because those data can be captured in other parts of the record. Like I said, if there's where the question would be, where would something like the mode of transport, the mode of EMS transport be captured if you had to put it into a quote unquote regular medical record, where would that go, or where do you see that going? And if it would go into some place that's already there, like let's say a problem list, or maybe it's not, or maybe a procedure, emergency transport with lights and sirens could be considered a procedure, but I know that it's not coded that way. So depending on whether or not that could be a new data element, it could be a new data element that might be able to capture other things besides EMS care. But that would just be a matter of a discussion. And people can submit anything that they want, and we'll work with you to sort of shape that submission. And if we can shape it in a way that would support multiple other care settings, then that's a win for everybody.
Makes sense. Thank you. Dr. Taylor, looks like you have one question in the chat from Mark Roberts, California. How do you handle patient matching in USCDI?
Well, so the components of the patient matching is a process. The data elements that the demographic data element are some of the elements that are used for patient matching, and not all of them. So patient identifiers, insurance numbers, other things like that are not part of USCDI, but systems still have to do patient matching. They have to do patient matching when you exchange documents, and then the matching piece is built into EHR functionality in general, not specifically to USCDI. So to the extent that the patient matching algorithm uses all or some or more than what's in USCDI, the demographics data elements within USCDI, and possibly other data elements within USCDI could be used for matching. But because matching is a process and not a simple data set, USCDI is not in and of itself is not sufficient to do patient matching, but the data elements would contribute to matching.
Thank you. That's all the questions in the chat, I think.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. that kind of puts us towards the end of the day. We've got a little bit of time left for questions and answers, either related to the last two presentations or if anyone has any questions in general they'd like to speak about. Monet, I think if you have any feedback or questions, we can go to you or Julianne or Clay.
I don't have anything.
Yeah, folks, any additional questions regarding the topics of today? Any last comments? I know that lots of additional information came in to the chat, and we will, as we mentioned, we'll aggregate all that information. Anything else that folks want to talk about or want to make sure that we cover during the meeting tomorrow?
Looks like there is one question for Dr. Taylor. Do you have any links for the data set for US CDI version 2?
Yep, I'll put it in the chat. I'll put it in the chat right now.
Great, thank you.
Just real quickly, hi, this is Steve Johnson with PWW. One of the things issue that we see cropping up more and more frequently has to do with basically the fact that years ago, the EPCR program was determined to go from more than just truly a patient care report to a data collection tool. And there are some data elements that the two sides of the house have similar terminology, and it's more frequently being misinterpreted by auditors. And so the way crews are being trained to enter stuff for data collection purposes is really killing them on the being fairly reimbursed side, because CMS and the Medicare contractors interpret things that show up on that patient care report in ways that ought not to be. And how we can better train both sides of the house to understand terminology the same. One that comes to mind is a field where crew members are asked to enter why the particular facility they transported a patient to was chosen. And some of the options are it was the closest facility, family choice, patient choice. And the way Medicare and all of the contractors interprets that field is if you went to a local facility, you will have chosen the reason closest facility. And I think too many times those that fill out the PCR misinterpret that, and they think literally get out a tape measure closest facility. But what the question when CMS reads it is asking is, did you go to a local facility, in other words, closest facility, or did you bypass all local facilities? And if so, what was the reason for bypassing all local facilities? Patient choice, family choice, nearness of home. And we recently are seeing a ton of denials based on the way that field is answered. And we're struggling with how do we help both sides of the house to interpret some of this stuff the same way so that one side's not killing the other. And I guess what I mean by that is crews too often don't understand what that question is asking. And they think, well, why was a facility chosen? Well, we had 6 local facilities that we could choose from. Any one of them is appropriate. So we let the patient choose. And so they answer the question, patient choice. Well, what that's telling all of the auditors and CMS is we bypassed all local facilities due to patient choice. And just want to throw that out here to the group and I think there are other examples like that, but that's just one to throw out. All of this stuff is great. And how can we all work together to not have operations killing the financial side of the house just because of misunderstandings of fields?
That sounds more like an issue for NEMSIS to address in the definitions of the elements. So yeah, I had never interpreted it that way myself, honestly, either. Not being a field clinician, but the most driving reason that you chose the facility that you did, and there's also separate ones for Medicare reasons for what you did, transport codes and whatnot.
Yeah, and that particular element allows multiple answers. So they could say that it was the closest facility and it was the patient's choice, which probably wouldn't be a problem. But I'm sure there's examples throughout the standard that need to be looked at like that.
Yeah, this is Clay. Yeah, Steve, that's a great example. And really, when the standard is modified, or when we have a document that extends provides extended data definitions, that could be helpful here for some of the elements. But yeah, the folks that are suggesting the choices and the actions associated with those, what actions would be associated with what codes within what elements, those are all a clinical bent. There's really no one that is there from billing to indicate how it would be interpreted for billing. So that's a great point. Yeah, maybe we Eric has been working very closely with CMS and CMMI through the ET3 project and a couple of other related projects. Maybe we can make some headway. And actually, I know there's some folks on the call from today from CMS. So maybe we can kind of log this question. We have a call with them on Monday mornings, and so maybe we can log this question and bring it to them to see if there's a way to bring more harmony there.
Thank you much. Appreciate the opportunity to bring it up.
Anything else we can address, or any other questions for the group? If not, I'm going to hand it over to Lori and we'll have a close us out.
Sounds good. My name is Lori Brott, and I am going to wrap this up today. I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. We recognize that your time is valuable, and we appreciate the 4 hours that you dedicated today. Hopefully you found it helpful. And we also want to say thank you for all of your input and feedback. We really do make note of it and will use it as we make decisions moving forward. So thank you for your engagement and participation. And we have a full schedule tomorrow with lots of valuable information. So we look forward to seeing you back with us again tomorrow. Thanks so much. We'll see you soon.